Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine that you are not here. Imagine that you were never here, that this world you know, this century you inhabit, this life you lead with its small comforts and quiet certainties, never existed at all. Instead, imagine that you open your eyes and find yourself somewhere else entirely. Somewhere vast and terrible, and old beyond reckoning. You are born not into the 21st century, but into the 41st millennium, or perhaps the 42nd, because the calendar itself has grown unreliable after 10,000 years of war and bureaucratic decay. You are not born on Earth, though the planet still exists. They call it Terra now, and it is the throne world of an empire so large that the human mind cannot truly grasp its scale. You are born instead on one of the million worlds that orbit distant suns under alien skies, a subject of the Imperium of man, the largest and most oppressive civilization that has ever existed. You are not a space marine, you are not an inquisitor, you are not a tech priest or a commissar or a rogue trader. You are something far more common and far more expendable. You are a civilian, and this is what your life looks like. The first thing you need to understand about civilian life in the Imperium is that there is no single civilian experience. The Imperium of man stretches across the entirety of the Milky Way galaxy. It encompasses over 1 million inhabited worlds, each one unique, each one governed by its own laws and customs and traditions, each one shaped by its own history and its own particular brand of suffering. But the variety is staggering. On one world, you might be born into a towering hive city that stretches miles into the sky, a place where billions of human beings are packed together in conditions that would make the most crowded slum on modern Earth look like a paradise resort. On another world, you might be born into a feudal society that has barely discovered gunpowder, living under the rule of a warrior aristocracy that rides to battle on the backs of great reptilian beasts, completely unaware that the stars above you are full of horrors beyond imagination. On yet another world, you might tend vast fields of grain that stretch from horizon to horizon, your entire existence dedicated to growing food that will be shipped across the stars to feed soldiers fighting wars you will never see and could never comprehend. The Imperium does not care about your comfort. It does not care about your happiness. It does not care whether you live a long and fulfilling life or die screaming in some forgotten corner of a factory floor before your 30th birthday. What the Imperium cares about is your productivity. It cares about what you can contribute to the endless war effort that has consumed humanity for 10,000 years. It cares about your tithe, that portion of your world's output, whether measured in raw materials or manufactured goods or warm bodies for the Imperial Guard, that must be rendered up to the distant masters on Terra. It cares about your obedience. It cares about your faith. And if you fail in any of these duties, the Imperium has ways of dealing with you that make death look like a kindness. But here is the strange and complicated truth that sits at the heart of civilian life in this universe. Despite all of this, despite the grinding oppression and the cosmic horror and the sheer, overwhelming bleakness of existence in the 41st millennium, people still live. They still love. They still raise children and tell stories and dream about better days. They still laugh, though the laughter is often bitter. They still find beauty in the strangest and most unlikely places. Because that is what humans do. That is what humans have always done, even when the universe itself seems determined to grind them into dust. So let us walk together through the many worlds of the Imperium and see what we find. Let us look at the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Let us explore the hive cities and the agri-worlds. There's the forge worlds and the feudal planets, the shrine worlds and the mining colonies. Let us see what people eat and drink and believe and fear and hope for. Let us understand what it truly means to be a civilian in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, because the wars of the 41st millennium are fought by space marines and Imperial Guard soldiers, by titans and battleships and weapons that can crack planets apart like eggshells. But behind every army and every fleet and every holy crusade, there are trillions upon trillions of ordinary human beings whose labor and whose faith and whose silent, unrecognized sacrifice make all of it possible. These are the people whose names will never appear in any history book, whose deeds will never be recorded in any archive, whose lives and deaths will be utterly forgotten within a generation. They are the foundation upon which the entire Imperium is built, and without them, everything would crumble into nothing. This is their story. Let us begin where the largest number of Imperial citizens live, in the hive cities, those impossible monuments to humanity's desperate need to survive. Picture a mountain. Now make it larger. Make it so large that its peak disappears into the clouds, so large that its base covers hundreds of square miles, so large that it has its own weather patterns and its own internal ecosystem and its own gravity anomalies caused by the sheer, concentrated mass of metal and concrete and human flesh packed into its structure. Now understand that this mountain is not natural, and every inch of it was built by human hands over the course of thousands of years, layer upon layer upon layer of construction, each generation building on top of what came before, until the whole structure became something that defied easy description. This is a hive city. This is home to billions. A single hive city on a major hive world might house anywhere from 10 billion to 100 billion human beings. To put that number in perspective, the current population of Earth is roughly 8 billion people. A single hive city can hold more than 10 times that number within its walls. And on the great hive worlds, there are not just one or two of these structures. There are dozens, sometimes hundreds, all clustered together, connected by transit tubes and underground tunnels and vast highways that run like arteries between the massive structures, carrying people and goods and information from one hive to the next. Necromunda is perhaps the most famous of all hive worlds, the one most thoroughly documented in imperial records, the one whose gangs and guilds and noble houses have become legendary across the sector. But Necromunda is not unique. It is merely representative. Thousands of worlds across the Imperium bear similar structures, similar populations, similar hierarchies of wealth and poverty and violence. What makes Necromunda notable is simply that so many people have bothered to write about it, to catalogue its horrors and its wonders, and the peculiar ways in which human beings have adapted to living in conditions that would seem nightmarish to anyone from our century. The structure of a hive city is, at its most basic, a vertical hierarchy. And that hierarchy is not merely architectural, it is social, economic, political, and spiritual, all at once. Where you live within the hive determines everything about your life, from what you eat, to what you breathe, to how long you are likely to survive. The higher you climb, the better your conditions become. The lower you descend, the worse things get, until you reach depths where the very concept of civilization has been abandoned entirely, and only the strongest and most ruthless survive. At the very top of the hive are the spires. These are the gleaming towers that pierce the upper atmosphere, rising above the perpetual smog and pollution that blankets the rest of the structure. The spires are where the wealthy live, the noble houses, and the merchant dynasties, and the high-ranking officials of the administratum and the ecclesiarchy. Up here, the air is clean. It is filtered and purified, and sometimes even perfumed with scents imported from distant paradise worlds. The food is real, not the processed synthetic paste that sustains the masses below. Actual meat from actual animals, grown on agri-worlds light years away and shipped at enormous expense to grace the tables of the elite. Fresh fruit, vegetables that still have dirt on their roots, a dirt from a planet that still has natural soil rather than the toxic chemical sludge that passes for ground on most hive worlds. Wine made from grapes rather than recycled chemical compounds. Bread baked from genuine grain rather than pressed from the rendered remains of the dead. Yes, you read that correctly. We will get to that later. The nobility of the spires live lives of extraordinary luxury by imperial standards. which means they live lives roughly comparable to the upper middle class in the modern developed world, with the addition of some technologies that are either wonderfully advanced or hideously archaic, depending on the specific device in question. They have servants, both human and mechanical. They have access to medical care that can extend their natural lifespans well beyond what we would consider normal. Some noble houses can trace their lineages back thousands of years, their wealth and power accumulating across generations like sediment at the bottom of a river, growing deeper and heavier with each passing century until the weight of tradition and privilege becomes almost a physical force. But even in the spires, life is not what we would call free. The nobility of a hive world exists within a web of obligation and expectation and political maneuvering that would exhaust the most seasoned diplomat. They owe fealty to the planetary governor, who in turn owes fealty to the sector authorities, who in turn answer to the distant and incomprehensible bureaucracy of Terra itself. Their wealth exists at the pleasure of those above them in the hierarchy, and it can be stripped away in an instant if they fall out of favor, or if some distant administratum clerk makes an error in their records. They are expected to support the imperial war effort, to fund military expeditions, to provide troops and equipment and resources whenever the Imperium demands them. And they are watched, always watched, by the Adeptus Arbites, and the agents of the Inquisition, and the ever-present informers who lurk in every court and every council chamber, ready to report even the faintest whisper of disloyalty or heresy. But compared to what waits below them, the nobles of the spires live in paradise. Descend from the spires, and you enter the upper hive, where the more successful merchants and mid-level officials make their homes. The air here is still breathable, though it carries a faint metallic tang that never quite goes away. The food is adequate, mostly processed, but still recognizable as food, rather than the grey slurry that feeds the lower levels. The lighting is artificial, the sun nothing more than a memory or a myth, depending on how many generations your family has lived in the hive. Most people in the upper hive have never seen natural sunlight. They have never felt rain on their faces or wind in their hair. The concept of weather is something they might read about in old texts or see depicted in the faded murals that decorate the walls of the more ancient sections of the hive, but it is not something they have ever experienced personally. The sky, to them, is a ceiling. It has always been a ceiling. It will always be a ceiling. Below the upper hive lies the mid-hive, and this is where the majority of a hive city's working population lives and labors. If the spires are the brain of the hive and the upper hive is its nervous system, then the mid-hive is its muscle. This is where the manufactorums are located, the vast factory complexes that produce everything from lasgun power packs to clothing to the processed food rations that feed the billions of mouths that the hive must sustain. The mid-hive is a place of constant noise and constant motion, of conveyor belts and stamping presses and chemical vats, and the endless grinding roar of machinery that never stops, never rests, never falls silent even for a moment. The workers of the mid-hive live in hab blocks, enormous residential structures that are packed with tiny apartments, and each one barely large enough to contain a cot and a small storage unit and a shared communal lavatory at the end of the hall. A typical hab block might house tens of thousands of people in a space that a modern architect would consider adequate for a few hundred at most. Privacy is a luxury that most hive workers have never known. The walls are thin. The sounds of neighbors arguing, coupling, weeping, and dying are as familiar as your own heartbeat. You learn to sleep through screams. You learn to ignore the constant smell of unwashed bodies and industrial chemicals and the faint, sweet, nauseating undertone of the recycling vats that process the hive's organic waste into something that can be used again. A hive worker's day begins when the shift horn sounds. There is no natural light to mark the passage of time in the mid-hive. So, the day is divided into shifts, each one measured by the horns that blast through the corridors at regular intervals. their sound so loud and so pervasive that it penetrates even the deepest sleep. When the horn sounds, you rise, you wash, if water is available, and if there is time, you eat, usually a ration bar or a bowl of nutrient gruel dispensed from a communal feeding station, and then you walk, sometimes for miles through the winding corridors and transit tunnels that connect your hab block to your assigned manufactorum, joining the vast river of humanity that flows through the hive's arteries like blood through a body. The work itself varies depending on the manufactorum's purpose, but it is almost always physically demanding, mentally numbing, and dangerous. Safety regulations, to the extent that they exist at all, are treated as suggestions rather than requirements. Machinery that would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards is standard equipment in most imperial manufactorums. Workers lose fingers and hands and arms with such regularity that the local medici, the imperial equivalent of a doctor, often has prosthetic replacements ready to install before the injured worker has even finished screaming. These prosthetics are crude things, basic mechanical devices that restore some function, but none of the sensation of the original limb. But they allow the worker to return to their post, which is all that matters. A shift in a typical manufactorum lasts between 12 and 16 standard hours, though shifts of 20 hours or more are not uncommon during periods of high demand, which in the Imperium state of perpetual war means essentially always. Overtime is not compensated, it is expected. Failure to meet production quotas can result in penalties ranging from reduced rations to physical punishment to reassignment to even less desirable postings. The concept of a weekend or a holiday does not exist in any meaningful sense for the average hive worker. There are feast days, religious observances dedicated to the emperor or to local saints, during which work may be temporarily suspended to allow for mandatory attendance at prayer services. But these are not days of rest in the way we would understand them. They are days of devotion, of kneeling on hard floors in packed cathedrals while priests deliver sermons that can last for hours, and exhorting the faithful to greater sacrifice and greater obedience in the emperor's name. The transit systems that move workers through a hive city are worth considering, because they represent one of the few areas where the scale of imperial engineering directly touches the daily lives of ordinary people. The internal transit systems of a major hive city are vast and complex, a network of mag rails, cargo lifts, transit tubes, and pedestrian corridors that connect the various levels and districts of the hive. At peak times, these systems carry millions of people, the river of humanity flowing through the hive's arteries with a volume and a speed that would make the rush hour on any modern Earth city look quaint by comparison. The mag rail systems are the backbone of hive transit, the enormous trains that run on magnetic levitation tracks through tunnels bored through the hive's structure. The cars are packed beyond any reasonable capacity, with workers standing shoulder to shoulder in spaces that were designed for half as many people. The air inside a packed mag rail car is thick and stale, a concentrated distillation of unwashed bodies and industrial chemicals, and the faint metallic tang that permeates everything in the hive. The noise is constant and overwhelming, the roar of the train's engines mixing with the buzz of conversation and the automated announcements that blare from speakers mounted at every station, reminding passengers of their duties to the emperor and warning against seditious behavior. The cargo lifts are another essential piece of the hive's infrastructure, our enormous platforms that carry goods and people vertically between the hive's many levels. These lifts are massive, some large enough to carry heavy vehicles and industrial equipment, and they operate around the clock, moving raw materials down to the industrial levels and finished products up to the distribution centers. Workers who live on one level and work on another may spend a significant portion of their daily commute riding these lifts, standing in groups on the vast platforms as they descend or ascend through the hive's vertical expanse, watching the numbers on the level indicators tick past like a countdown to another day of labor. Communication within the Imperium is another aspect of civilian life that deserves attention, because the ability to communicate, or the lack of that ability, and shapes every aspect of how people interact with each other and with the institutions that govern them. Within a single hive city, communication is relatively straightforward. Vox systems, the imperial equivalent of radio communications, allow for voice transmission across the hive's various levels and districts. Public address systems broadcast official announcements, propaganda, and religious programming to every corner of the inhabited areas. Data slates, flat electronic devices that function as a combination of tablet computer and e-reader, are used by the more literate segments of the population for personal communications and for accessing the limited information networks that exist within the hive. But interplanetary communication is another matter entirely. There is no equivalent of the internet in the Imperium. There is no instantaneous communication between worlds. The only method of long-distance communication available to the Imperium is astropathic transmission, a form of psychic communication carried out by the astropaths, psychers who have been soul-bound to the Emperor and who use their abilities to send and receive messages through the warp. Astropathic communication is unreliable, expensive, and available only to the most important and urgent messages. An ordinary citizen cannot send an astropathic message to a friend on another world. They cannot call their son, who has been conscripted into the Imperial Guard. They cannot reach out to anyone beyond the boundaries of their own planet. For all practical purposes, the average Imperial citizen is confined to their own world, their knowledge of events beyond their immediate horizon limited to whatever the authorities choose to tell them and whatever rumors filter through the population via merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers. This isolation is one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of civilian life in the Imperium. Human beings are social creatures who need connection with others to maintain their mental and emotional health. The inability to communicate with loved ones who have been taken away, whether by conscription or by the demands of imperial service, creates a grief that never fully resolves, a wound that cannot heal because it is never given the information it needs to close. You do not know if your son is alive or dead. You do not know if your sister has arrived safely at her new posting. You do not know what is happening on the other side of the galaxy, or even on the other side of the sector. You know only what is in front of you, the walls of your hab block, the machines of your manufactorum, the faces of the people in your immediate community. Everything else is a mystery, and mysteries in the Imperium have a way of becoming terrors if you think about them too long. When the shift ends and you return to your hab block, the time that remains before the next shift horn sounds is your own. Some workers spend it sleeping. Some spend it in the communal areas that serve as the hive's equivalent of social gathering places, dark and smoky rooms where rot-gut alcohol and low-grade narcotics are available for those who have the credits to pay for them. Some spend it with their families. Though the concept of family in a hive city is often more fluid than what we are accustomed to. Marriage exists, but it is frequently an economic arrangement rather than a romantic one. Two workers combining their rations and their living space because survival is easier together than alone. Children are raised communally in many hive districts, the demands of the work schedule making it impossible for both parents to be present at the same time. A child in the mid-hive might be watched over by a rotation of neighbors and relatives and whoever else happens to be available, spending their early years in the corridors and communal spaces of the hab block until they are old enough to be put to work themselves, which in many hive worlds happens disturbingly early by our standards. This is life in the mid-hive. Well, this is the life of the majority, but it gets worse. Below the mid-hive lies the lower hive, and below that, the underhive. The lower hive is where the industrial heart of the hive city beats loudest. This is where the heaviest manufacturing takes place, where the generatoriums produce the power that keeps the entire structure alive, where the recycling plants process the hive's waste into usable materials. The air in the lower hive is thick with fumes and particulates, so dense that it reduces visibility to a few dozen meters and leaves a gritty residue on every surface. Breathing it unfiltered for extended periods causes a condition known colloquially as hive lung, a degenerative respiratory disease that slowly destroys the tissue of the lungs over the course of years. Eventually, making it impossible to breathe without the assistance of a mechanical respirator. Most people in the lower hive develop some degree of hive lung by the time they reach middle age, and the sound of labored, wheezing breath is as common as the sound of machinery. The workers of the lower hive do the jobs that nobody in the levels above them wants to do. They maintain the power generators. They operate the recycling plants. They work in the chemical processing facilities, where toxic compounds are refined and mixed and packaged for use in the manufactorums above. They clean the sewer systems and the waste ducts and the ventilation shafts that keep air circulating through the hive's lower levels. They are the people who keep the hive alive. Yes, and they are rewarded for this essential service with the worst living conditions that the hive has to offer, short of the underhive itself. And then there is the underhive. The underhive is what happens when a city grows so old and so large that its foundations begin to decay. Over the course of centuries and millennia, the lowest levels of a hive city are gradually abandoned by the official authorities. Power is shut off. Maintenance ceases. The infrastructure is allowed to crumble and collapse, creating a vast underground labyrinth of ruined buildings and collapsed tunnels and flooded chambers that extends for miles beneath the functioning levels of the hive above. This is the underhive, and it is a world unto itself. In the underhive, there is no law. There are no authorities, no police, no officials of any kind. The Adeptus Arbites, or the Imperial Law Enforcement Agency, does not venture into the underhive unless circumstances are truly extraordinary. The planetary enforcers, the local police forces that handle day-to-day crime in the upper levels, treat the underhive as a no-go zone. What happens down there is simply not their problem, and anyone who descends into those depths does so at their own risk. The inhabitants of the underhive are a mixed lot. Some are criminals who have fled the upper levels to escape punishment. Some are political dissidents or religious deviants who have been driven underground by persecution. Some are mutants, human beings who have been born with physical or genetic abnormalities caused by generations of exposure to toxic chemicals and low-level radiation, and who have been cast out of the upper levels because the Imperium views mutation with suspicion and fear. And some are simply people who were born down there, whose parents were born down there, whose grandparents were born down there. People for whom the underhive is the only world they have ever known. Life in the underhive is organized, to the extent that it is organized at all, around gangs. These are not the street gangs of modern cities, small groups of disaffected youths engaging in petty crime. These are large, well-armed, and highly organized paramilitary groups that control territory, run businesses, enforce their own laws, and engage in warfare with rival gangs over resources, trade routes, and political influence. On Necromunda, the most famous gangs are affiliated with the great clan houses that dominate the planet's industrial output. House Goliath, whose members are genetically and chemically enhanced for strength and endurance. House Escher, an all-female house known for its expertise in chemical warfare and narcotics production. House Orlok, the miners and road warriors who control the planet's ore trade. House Van Saar, the tech-savvy house whose mastery of technology gives them an edge in a world where working equipment is the ultimate currency. House Delac, the Shadow House, whose members deal in secrets and information, and whose loyalties are as murky as the dark corridors they inhabit. House Cawdor, the Fanatics, burning with religious zeal and scavenging the underhive for anything of value. These gangs fight for control of the underhive's limited resources, functioning technology, clean water, breathable air, and food. The gang wars of the underhive are brutal and unrelenting, fought with a mixture of scavenged Imperial weaponry, improvised explosives, and crude melee weapons in the cramped tunnels and ruined buildings that make up the underhive's terrain. Young men and women are recruited into the gangs from an early age, trained in the use of weapons and the ways of violence, and sent out to fight for territory and honor and the simple right to survive. And below even the underhive, in the deepest and most ancient foundations of the hive, lies what is sometimes called the hive bottom. This is a place of near total darkness, but of toxic chemical pools and radioactive waste, and creatures that have adapted to life in conditions so hostile that they would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The hive bottom is inhabited only by the most desperate and the most monstrous, beings that are barely recognizable as human anymore, mutants and madmen, and things that defy easy classification. It is a place of nightmares, and even the most hardened underhive gangers avoid it whenever possible. There is a particular kind of silence in the underhive that is different from any silence you might know. It is not the absence of sound, because the underhive is never truly quiet. There is always the distant hum of machinery from the levels above, the drip of condensation from corroded pipes, the skittering of vermin in the darkness, the occasional echoing crack of a weapon being discharged somewhere in the tunnels. The silence of the underhive is not acoustic. It is social. It is the silence of a place where no authority exists, where no one is listening, where your screams will not bring help and your prayers will not be answered. It is the silence of abandonment, and it is the sound that the lowest members of imperial society hear from the day they are born until the day they die. Children born in the underhive grow up fast, or they do not grow up at all. There are no schools, there are no playgrounds, there are no institutions of any kind dedicated to the welfare of the young. A child in the underhive learns to fight before they learn to read, assuming they learn to read at all. Their education comes from the gang, from the settlement, or from whatever group of survivors they happen to have been born into. They learn which tunnels are safe and which ones will kill you. They learn which fungi are edible and which ones will give you hallucinations or shut down your kidneys. They learn to recognize the sounds of different weapons and to estimate the distance and direction of a firefight from the echoes alone. They learn that kindness is a luxury and that mercy is a weakness, and that the only reliable ally you have in this world is the weapon in your hand. And yet, even here, something survives. In the settlements of the underhive, communities form around shared resources and mutual defense. People who have nothing still find ways to share what little they have. They're pooling their food and their water and their ammunition against the constant threat of rival gangs and the creatures that lurk in the deeper dark. Elders, those rare individuals who have survived long enough to accumulate wisdom, are respected and consulted, their knowledge of the underhive's geography and dangers passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation. There are even celebrations, crude festivals organized around the successful defense of a settlement, or the discovery of a new water source, or the birth of a child who is born healthy and whole in a place where genetic mutation is almost expected. The gangs themselves, for all their violence, provide a kind of social structure in the absence of any other. They have their own hierarchies, their own codes of conduct, their own systems of justice. And a gang leader who abuses their power or who fails to provide for their fighters will find themselves replaced, usually violently, by someone who can do the job better. Loyalty is valued above almost everything else in the underhive, because in a place where you cannot rely on any external authority to protect you, the bonds between individuals are the only thing standing between you and oblivion. The settlements of the underhive range from tiny encampments of a few dozen people huddled around a functioning water, still to sprawling towns of several thousand, built in the ruins of ancient hab blocks and factory complexes. The more successful settlements have functioning power, scavenged generators that provide enough electricity for lighting and basic heating. They have workshops where skilled artisans repair weapons and equipment. Their skills passed down through apprenticeships that would not look out of place in a medieval guild system. They have marketplaces where traders exchange goods, everything from ammunition to food to salvage technology, the economy of the underhive running on barter and personal reputation, rather than any formal currency. The most prized commodity in the underhive is functioning technology. A working lasgun is worth more than gold. A functioning medical device is worth more than a working lasgun. A piece of archaeotech, some ancient and poorly understood device from an earlier age of human civilization, can spark wars between rival gangs that last for years and leave entire districts in ruins. The tech-savvy gangs, particularly House Van Saar on Necromunda, hold enormous power precisely because of their ability to maintain and repair technology that other groups can only use until it breaks and then discard. Water, as we have mentioned, is controlled by the guilds, and the Water Guild's caravans are the lifeline of the Underhive. These caravans are heavily armed and heavily guarded, because the cargo they carry is more valuable than anything else that moves through the tunnels. A single hijacked water caravan can sustain a settlement for weeks. It can also trigger a gang war that consumes entire districts in violence and leaves the tunnels choked with the dead. And at the very bottom of this vertical world, in the flooded ruins and toxic lakes of the hive bottom, things live that have long since ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. Are mutants twisted by millennia of exposure to industrial waste and low-level radiation. Creatures that have evolved in darkness so complete that they have no eyes, navigating instead by sonar or by the detection of body heat. Things that are spoken of in whispers by even the most hardened gangers, shapeless horrors that drag themselves through the poisoned water on limbs that were never designed to carry a body, mouths that open in places where mouths should not be. This, then, is the hive world in all its terrible verticality. From the gleaming spires where the wealthy dine on real food beneath artificial sunlight, to the pitch-black depths where mutated creatures crawl through pools of toxic waste. It is a vertical cross-section of everything the Imperium is and everything it has become over 10,000 years of war and decay and desperate, grinding survival. It is not a place designed for human happiness. It was not built with comfort or well-being in mind. It was built for efficiency, for production, for the singular purpose of keeping the great machine of the Imperium fed and supplied and armed. And yet people live there, billions upon billions of them, and most of them will never know anything else. Now let us talk about what those people eat, because it is perhaps the single most revealing detail about civilian life in the Imperium. The detail that tells you more about what it means to be an ordinary person in the 41st millennium than any grand narrative about wars and heroes and the fate of empires. But the diet of an imperial citizen varies enormously depending on where they live and how much wealth they have access to. At the very top of the social hierarchy, as we have already discussed, the wealthy eat well. They have access to real food, organic produce grown on dedicated agricultural worlds and shipped across the stars at great expense. They eat actual grains and actual meats and actual vegetables, prepared by actual cooks, using actual recipes that have been passed down through generations of household servants. For the nobles of the spires, food is not merely sustenance. It is a social ritual, a display of wealth and status, a way of demonstrating their place in the hierarchy. A noble house might spend more on a single banquet than an entire hab block of workers earns in a year, and they would consider the expense entirely justified. For everyone else, the situation is rather different. The primary food source for the vast majority of imperial citizens, particularly those living on hive worlds, is processed nutrient paste. This comes in various forms, from the thin gruel dispensed at communal feeding stations to the compressed ration bars that workers carry in their pockets to eat during breaks. The composition of this paste varies from world to world and manufacturer to manufacturer, but the basic principle is the same everywhere. Organic material, sourced from whatever is available, is broken down into its component proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, then reconstituted into a standardized product that provides the minimum nutritional requirements necessary to keep a human being alive and functional. Yet the taste is universally described as flat, bland, faintly metallic, and vaguely unpleasant in a way that is difficult to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. The organic material used to make this paste comes from a variety of sources. Some of it is genuine agricultural produce, shipped in from agri-worlds in the form of dried grains and processed vegetable matter. Some of it is fungal in origin, harvested from the vast fungal farms that grow in the damp, dark, lower levels of many hive cities. Algae is another common source, cultivated in great vats of recycled water and processed into a protein-rich slurry that can be mixed with other ingredients to create something approaching food. And then there is corpse starch. Corpse starch is exactly what it sounds like, and if you need a moment to sit with that, take it. On many hive worlds, the dead are not buried or cremated in the way that we would understand. They are collected by specialized guilds, their bodies transported to processing plants where they are rendered down into their component organic compounds, which are then mixed with other materials to create a grey, protein-dense paste. This paste is pressed into loaves, biscuits, or nutrient blocks and distributed to the population as food. On Necromunda, the Corpse Guild controls this entire process. They gather thousands of dead bodies every day, filling their mortuary caravans with the recently deceased, then transport them to the great corpse grinder plants that occupy entire sectors of every hive city. There, the bodies are processed with mechanical efficiency, the useful organic material extracted, the bones separated for other uses, and the resulting paste packaged and distributed to the masses. Millions of people are born and die on Necromunda every single day, and without the orderly disposal of their bodies, plague and disease would sweep through the overcrowded hive in a matter of weeks. And without the food that those bodies provide when processed, the population would starve. This is not a secret.
Honestly, this is the part of 40k lore that I find the most compelling. Forget the Space Marines for a second, forget the Primarchs and the God tier battles. The civilian stuff is what actually makes this setting hit different. Because when you strip away all the power armor and the bolter fire, what you are left with is just people trying to get through the day, and that is something every single one of us can relate to. I think that's why this hobby pulls people in so deep. It's not really about the war, it's about what the war costs, and it's about the guy eating his bland ration bar on a factory floor who has never seen sunlight. And he doesn't even know that's something he should miss. That messes with me every time I sit down to research one of these scripts. The scale of it just sits in your chest. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's get back to the video.
The inhabitants of hive worlds know, on some level, what their food is made from. But the knowledge is wrapped in layers of euphemism and willful ignorance and religious justification. The ecclesiarchy teaches that to serve the emperor even in death is the highest honor, that the recycling of the faithful into sustenance for the living is a sacred act of communal sacrifice. To express disgust at the taste of corpse starch is, in some jurisdictions, unconsidered seditious conduct, an implicit rejection of the Imperium's bounty, and by extension, of the emperor himself. The taste, for those wondering, is described as flat, saline, and faintly metallic. It is not unpleasant in any specific way. It is simply bland, a flavor so neutral and so pervasive that it becomes the default taste of existence for billions of people who have never eaten anything else. It is the taste of survival. The taste of a civilization that has been at war for so long that it has consumed itself, literally and figuratively, in the process. Beyond corpse starch and nutrient paste, there are other options for those with the means to obtain them. Recaf, a hot beverage made from brewed leaves, is perhaps the most popular drink in the Imperium, the 41st Millennium's answer to coffee. Its composition varies from world to world, but it almost always contains caffeine or a similar stimulant, and it serves the same social function that coffee serves in our world, a small daily pleasure, a moment of warmth and stimulation in an otherwise grinding existence. Workers in hive factories cup their hands around tin mugs of recaf during their brief breaks, the steam rising from the dark liquid the closest thing to luxury that most of them will ever know. Alcohol is widespread and takes many forms. Rotgut booze is the catch-all term for the crude distilled spirits that are produced in every hive and every settlement across the Imperium, fermented from whatever organic material is available and distilled in improvised stills that range from sophisticated to dangerously crude. The quality varies as wildly as you might imagine. Some worlds produce genuinely excellent spirits, ales, and wines that are sought after across entire sectors. Most produce something that is best described as functional, a liquid that will get you drunk, which is the primary requirement, without killing you in the process, which is the secondary requirement, and one that is not always met. Narcotics are also common, particularly in the underhive and the lower levels of hive cities. Stimulants that allow workers to push through exhaustion during double shifts. Sedatives that provide a few hours of oblivion in hab blocks where the noise never stops. Hallucinogens that offer brief escapes from a reality that offers few pleasures. The narcotics trade is enormous, being controlled in some cases by legitimate guilds and in others by criminal organizations that operate in the shadows of the hive's economy. On some worlds, certain drugs are essentially sanctioned by the authorities, who recognize that a population that cannot occasionally numb its pain is a population that is likely to rebel. Water, too, is a commodity of enormous value, particularly in the lower levels of hive cities where the municipal supply is unreliable at best and non-existent at worst. On Necromunda, the Water Guild controls the supply and distribution of clean water throughout the hive, and their caravans are the lifeline for settlements in the Underhive and the Bad Zones. Some settlements rely entirely on the Water Guild for their survival. And the delay of a water caravan by even a few days can spell disaster for an entire community. Water theft is treated with extraordinary severity. The punishment, according to guild law, is surgical dehydration, a process exactly as horrible as it sounds. Air is another resource that we take for granted, but that is a matter of life and death in a hive city. The air in a hive is recycled constantly, drawn through vast filtration systems that remove the worst of the toxins and particulates before pumping it back into the inhabited areas. But these systems are not perfect, and they are frequently poorly maintained, and the deeper you go in the hive, the worse the air quality becomes. In the lower hive and the underhive, the air is a thick soup of industrial pollutants, chemical residue, and organic compounds that would trigger every alarm in a modern environmental monitoring station. Breathing, it is a slow form of poisoning, and it is one of the primary reasons that life expectancy in the lower levels of a hive city is dramatically shorter than in the upper levels, and this is just the hive worlds. On other types of worlds, the dietary experience can be very different. On agri-worlds, the people who grow the Imperium's food, ironically, often eat the poorest quality of it, subsisting on the rejected produce that cannot be processed for export, the bruised fruits and damaged grains, and imperfect vegetables that fail to meet the standards required for shipment off-world. On feudal worlds, people eat what they grow and what they hunt, living on diets not dissimilar to what medieval Europeans ate, or with all the nutritional deficiencies and seasonal scarcities that implies. On Forge worlds, the Adeptus Mechanicus feeds its workforce on precisely calibrated nutrient compounds designed to maximize productivity, rather than provide anything resembling a pleasant eating experience. Everywhere, though, the fundamental principle is the same. Food in the Imperium is fuel. It is not meant to be enjoyed. It is meant to keep you alive and working, and if it fails even in that basic function, then you are replaced by someone else who can survive on what is available. The Imperium does not waste resources on the comfort of its people. It wastes resources on war, and everything else, food included, is subordinate to that singular, overwhelming priority. Now let us turn our attention to the force that binds all of this together. That gives meaning and structure and purpose to lives that might otherwise seem utterly devoid of hope. Let us talk about faith. The imperial cult is not merely the state religion of the Imperium. It is the state itself, the glue that holds a million worlds together across the unfathomable distances of interstellar space. Without it, the Imperium would fragment into a billion warring factions, each one pursuing its own interests, each one vulnerable to the predatory forces that lurk in the darkness between the stars. The imperial cult is what makes the Imperium possible, and the Imperium's rulers know this, which is why they enforce it with a zeal that borders on mania and punish deviation from it with a severity that makes the historical inquisition of our own world look gentle by comparison. At the center of the imperial cult is the Emperor of Mankind, worshipped as a god, the divine protector and savior of the human race. The irony of this would be breathtaking if anyone in the Imperium was aware of it, because the emperor himself, during his lifetime, was an avowed opponent of religious worship. He deliberately outlawed organized religion during the Great Crusade, declaring it the source of much of the ignorance and division that had prevented humanity from achieving its potential. He insisted, publicly and repeatedly, that he was not a god, that he was merely an extraordinarily powerful human being, and that the veneration of any being as divine was an error that led inevitably to manipulation and oppression. And yet, here we are, 10,000 years later. And the Emperor is worshipped as a god by virtually every human being in the galaxy. His image adorns every temple and every shrine and every public building in the Imperium. His name is invoked in every prayer and every oath and every curse. His will, as interpreted by the priests of the ecclesiarchy, is the law that governs every aspect of civilian life, from what you eat to how you work to who you may associate with. To question his divinity is heresy. To deny it is death. The ecclesiarchy, formerly known as the Adeptus Ministorum, is the organization that administers the imperial cult. It is a vast and powerful institution, its influence extending to every corner of the Imperium, its priests and missionaries and bureaucrats numbering in the billions. The ecclesiarchy operates temples and cathedrals on every inhabited world, almost from the grandest cardinal worlds where entire continents are covered with religious architecture to the smallest frontier settlements, where a single shrine might serve a community of a few hundred souls. It runs the Schola Progenium, the orphanages that raise the children of imperial servants who have died in the line of duty, indoctrinating them with a strict orthodox education that produces some of the Imperium's most loyal and zealous citizens. It maintains the shrine worlds, entire planets dedicated to religious observance and pilgrimage, where the faithful travel from across the sector to visit sacred sites and venerate the relics of imperial saints. For the average citizen, faith is not a choice. It is the air you breathe. From birth, you are surrounded by the symbols and rituals of the imperial cult. The Aquila, as the twin-headed eagle that is the symbol of the Imperium, is everywhere, stamped on every piece of imperial currency, embossed on every piece of military equipment, carved into the walls of every building and painted on every surface. The Emperor's image, depicted in 1,000 different artistic styles but always recognizable, watches you from every public space. Prayers are built into the daily routine of work and rest, woven into the fabric of life so thoroughly that most people do not distinguish between their religious obligations and their secular ones. To pray is to work. To work is to pray. The two are the same thing, both expressions of devotion to the god Emperor, both contributions to the great machine of the Imperium. Religious services vary enormously from world to world, reflecting the incredible diversity of human cultures within the Imperium. The Imperial Creed, as the core theology of the imperial cult is known, is deliberately flexible, designed to be adapted to fit the native customs and traditions of whatever world it is practiced on. On one world, worship might take the form of solemn, silent meditation in austere stone chapels. On another, it might involve ecstatic dancing and singing and the ritual consumption of sacred intoxicants. On yet another, it might center around blood sacrifice and self-flagellation and acts of extreme physical endurance undertaken as demonstrations of devotion. The ecclesiarchy tolerates this vast range of practices because it has to. Standardizing religious observance across 1 million worlds with 1 million different cultures would be impossible, and any attempt to do so would likely cause more unrest than it prevented. But there are certain core tenets that are universal, and deviation from these is not tolerated. The Emperor is God. He has always been God. He will always be God. This is the first and most important tenet of the Imperial Creed, and it is non-negotiable. To suggest that the Emperor is anything less than divine To propose that he was merely a powerful human being rather than an actual deity is heresy of the highest order. The punishment for this particular form of heresy is typically death, carried out either by the ecclesiarchy itself or by the agents of the Inquisition, depending on the severity of the offense and the importance of the offender. All other gods are false. This is the second great tenet, and it is the one that places the imperial cult in direct and permanent opposition to the chaos gods and their worshippers. The existence of other powerful supernatural beings in the universe is not denied. The Imperium knows that the chaos gods are real, but they are not recognized as gods. They are recognized as enemies, as parasites, as malevolent forces that prey upon the weakness and corruption of the human soul. To worship them is the ultimate crime, the ultimate betrayal, the one sin for which there is no forgiveness and no redemption. Every citizen has a duty to the Emperor and to the Imperium. This duty manifests in obedience to authority, in diligent labor, in the payment of tithes, in the reporting of heresy and mutation and other threats to the social order. The concept of individual rights does not exist in the imperial cult. There are only duties. You have a duty to work. You have a duty to pray. You have a duty to obey. You have a duty to reproduce, to provide the next generation of workers and soldiers for the Imperium's endless war machine. And if you fail in any of these duties, you have failed the Emperor. And the Emperor does not forgive failure. For most imperial citizens, faith provides the only framework of meaning and purpose that their lives offer. When your existence is an endless cycle of labor and exhaustion and deprivation, when the concept of a better future is not merely unlikely but actively heretical, because to suggest that the Imperium could be improved is to suggest that the Emperor's design is imperfect, then faith is the only thing that makes the suffering bearable. The Emperor protects, the faithful say. The Emperor watches over us. The Emperor has a plan, and our suffering is part of that plan, and if we endure it with patience and devotion, we will be rewarded in the life to come. This is the promise that keeps trillions of people going, day after day, shift after shift, generation after generation. Whether or not it is true is, in a sense, irrelevant. What matters is that people believe it, and that belief keeps them functioning, and a functioning population is all the Imperium requires. The darker side of imperial faith is the persecution of those deemed to have strayed from it. Heresy is the Imperium's greatest fear, not because of what heretics believe, but because of what heresy represents. The loosening of the bonds that hold the Imperium together, the first crack in the wall that keeps chaos and alien corruption at bay. But the Imperium hunts heretics with the same single-minded determination that it hunts aliens and demons, and the punishments for heresy are designed not merely to destroy the heretic, but to serve as a warning to everyone else. Public executions are common, carried out in the squares and plazas of every hive city and every town across the Imperium. Burning is a traditional method, particularly for crimes of religious heresy, but other methods include hanging, beheading, and exposure, where the condemned is chained to a post in a public place and left to die of thirst and exposure while the citizenry watches. The purpose of these spectacles is not merely punitive, they are educational. They are reminders of what happens to those who stray from the Emperor's light. They are performances designed to reinforce the message that obedience is the only path to survival, and that the cost of defiance is too terrible to contemplate. For those who are not executed outright, there are other fates. Penal worlds, where criminals are sent to labor in conditions that make the worst hive factories look comfortable. Penal legions, where the convicted are armed with the most basic of weapons and sent to fight on the most dangerous front lines, their survival measured in days rather than years. And worst of all, perhaps, servitorization, a process in which the criminal's brain is partially or fully lobotomized, and their body is fitted with cybernetic augmentations, transforming them into a living machine, a servitor, capable of performing simple tasks but stripped of everything that once made them a person. Their memories, their personality, their capacity for thought and feeling, all of it erased, leaving behind only a shell of flesh and metal that obeys commands without comprehension or complaint. This is what awaits those who fail the Imperium. This is the stick that complements the carrot of faith and the promise of heavenly reward. Obey, and you will suffer, but your suffering will have meaning. Disobey, and you will suffer far worse, and your suffering will accomplish nothing at all. And what about those who are born different? What about the psychers? Psychic ability in humans typically manifests between the ages of 10 and 20 standard years, though it can appear earlier or later. The experience is terrifying for the individual and dangerous for everyone around them. A young psyker might suddenly find themselves hearing the thoughts of the people nearby, or moving objects without touching them, or seeing visions of events that have not yet occurred. These abilities are poorly understood even by the Imperium's experts, and they are feared with an intensity that borders on hysteria, because every psyker, no matter how benign their abilities might seem, represents a potential gateway for the malevolent entities of the warp to enter the material universe. When a psyker is identified, and Imperial law requires that they be reported immediately by anyone who becomes aware of their abilities, they are collected by the Black Ships. These are the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, enormous spacecraft that travel from world to world on regular circuits, gathering up psychers like a harvest. The Black Ships are not comfortable vessels. The psychers aboard them are treated as cargo rather than passengers, confined in cells designed to suppress their abilities and prevent them from drawing the attention of warp entities during transit. The journey to Terra, where most psychers are taken for evaluation, can last months or even years, depending on the vagaries of warp travel. Upon arrival at Terra, the psychers are evaluated by the adepts of the Astra Telepathica, tested and graded and sorted according to their abilities and their psychological resilience. A small number, those judged to be powerful enough and stable enough to be useful, are selected for training. These are the lucky ones, if the word can be applied to anyone in this situation. They will become sanctioned psychers, soul-bound to the Emperor through a ritual that hardens their minds against warp influence at the cost of their eyesight, and put to work as astropaths, the telepathic communicators who are essential to the functioning of the Imperium's communications network, or as battle psychers attached to Imperial Guard units to provide psychic support on the battlefield. The rest, the majority, the ones who are too weak or too unstable or too dangerous to be trained, are fed to the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is the great psychic beacon that shines in the warp, the light that guides the navigators of Imperial spacecraft through the hellish alternate dimension that makes faster-than-light travel possible. It is powered by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers every single day, as their psychic energy consumed by the Golden Throne and the Emperor's will and projected into the warp as a signal strong enough to be detected across the galaxy. The psychers who are fed to the Astronomicon do not survive the process. Their minds and their souls are burned away, consumed utterly, leaving nothing behind. They are, in the most literal sense possible, fuel for the Imperium's survival. This is the fate that awaits most human psychers. This is why families who discover that one of their children has psychic abilities are torn between the duty to report them and the desperate desire to hide them, to protect them from a fate that is worse than anything the family can imagine. This is why some psychers run, why they hide in the underhives and the wilderness and the dark places of the galaxy, living as fugitives, and knowing that discovery means the Black Ships and the long journey to Terra and the fire that consumes everything. And this is also why the Imperium fears psychers so deeply, because every unsanctioned psycher, every psychic individual who has not been trained and warded and soul-bound to the Emperor is a ticking bomb. Their minds are beacons in the warp, drawing the attention of demonic entities that would love nothing more than to use an untrained psyker as a doorway into the material universe. The stories of worlds that have been destroyed because a single unsanctioned psyker lost control of their abilities are not legends. They are documented fact. The Imperium's fear of psykers is not irrational. It is entirely justified by the evidence. But the methods by which it addresses that fear are, like so much else in the Imperium, brutal beyond measure. Let us leave the hive worlds now and visit some of the other types of worlds that make up the Imperium, because the hive experience, while it represents the lives of the largest number of people, is far from the only way that Imperial citizens live. Agri-worlds are, in many ways, the opposite of hive worlds. Where hive worlds are characterized by overcrowding, pollution, and the complete absence of natural environments, agri-worlds are vast expanses of cultivated land, entire planets dedicated to the single purpose of growing food. An agri-world typically has at least 85% of its surface given over to farmland, with the remaining 15% occupied by spaceports, transportation hubs, and the small settlements where the planet's workforce lives. And the population of an agri-world is relatively small compared to a hive world, usually only a few million to a few 100 million people, because the primary function of the planet is production rather than habitation. The people who live on agri-worlds are farmers, and their lives revolve around the seasonal cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting that have defined agricultural existence since the dawn of human civilization. In some ways, life on an agri-world can seem almost idyllic compared to the nightmare of the hive. The air is clean, the food is fresh, the sky is visible, a real sky with real weather and real sunlight, luxuries that billions of hive workers have never experienced and never will. But the reality is considerably less pleasant than the pastoral image might suggest. Agri-worlds exist to feed the Imperium, and the Imperium's appetite is insatiable. The tithes demanded of agri-worlds are enormous, calculated to extract the maximum possible output from the planet's agricultural capacity, with little regard for the welfare of the people who do the actual work. Most of the food produced on an agri-world is shipped off-planet, loaded into the holds of enormous transport vessels, and carried across the stars to feed the populations of hive worlds and the armies of the Astra Militarum. What remains for the local population is whatever the tithe collectors deem surplus, which is often very little. The result is a grim irony. The people who grow the Imperium's food often go hungry themselves, subsisting on the rejected and damaged produce that fails to meet the standards required for export. As they grow fields of golden grain that stretch to the horizon, but they eat the chaff and the sweepings from the threshing floor. They raise herds of livestock that are slaughtered and preserved and shipped to distant worlds, but they eat the offal and the scraps that are left behind. They live on a planet of abundance and experience a life of scarcity, their labor feeding billions, while they themselves are fed barely enough to survive. The social structure of an agri-world is usually simple and rigid, reflecting the practical demands of large-scale agriculture. At the top is the planetary governor, often an appointee of the administratum, or the hereditary head of a noble family that has controlled the world for generations. Below the governor are the landowners, the managers and overseers who control the vast estates that make up the planet's agricultural base. These estates can be enormous, covering thousands of square miles, and they are operated by a workforce of indentured laborers whose status is, in everything but name, that of serfs tied to the land. The laborers of an agri-world cannot leave without permission. They cannot change their occupation. They cannot refuse to work, because to refuse work is to refuse the emperor's will, and that is heresy. Their children will follow in their footsteps, tending the same fields and harvesting the same crops that their parents tended and harvested before them, and their grandparents before that, going back through generations that have forgotten when the cycle began and cannot imagine how it might end. The rhythms of life on an agri-world are dictated by the planet's seasons, which may or may not bear any resemblance to the seasons of Earth, depending on the world's orbital characteristics and atmospheric composition. Planting season is a time of intense labor, with every able-bodied person working from before dawn until after dark, to get the seeds into the ground before the weather turns. Harvest season is even more demanding, a period of sustained physical effort that pushes bodies to their limits and beyond, because every day of delay means lost produce and lost quota, and falling short of quota has consequences that range from reduced rations to punitive labor details to the arrival of administratum inspectors, whose disapproval can reshape the entire structure of the planet's governance. Between planting and harvest, the work continues, because on an agri-world, the work never truly stops. There are fields to be irrigated, crops to be tended, pests to be controlled, livestock to be managed, equipment to be maintained, fences to be mended, wells to be dug, and 1,000 other tasks that must be completed before the next season begins. The laborers work with tools that range from the primitive to the mechanical, depending on the world's level of technological development. On some agri-worlds, advanced agricultural machinery handles much of the heavy work. On others, the farming is done almost entirely by hand, vast human labor forces performing tasks that could be done by machines, but are not, because human labor is cheaper than machinery and easier to replace when it wears out, despite the harshness of their lives. But the people of agri-worlds often possess a kind of spiritual contentment that is rare in the Imperium. They live under open skies, they breathe clean air, they see the sun rise and set, they watch the seasons change and feel the connection to the land that has been fundamental to human existence since the dawn of civilization. Their work, for all its difficulty, is tangible and meaningful in a way that the repetitive tasks of a hive factory never can be. They plant seeds and watch them grow. They tend animals and see them thrive. They produce food that feeds the Imperium, and however little of that food they are allowed to keep for themselves, there is a satisfaction in the act of creation that no amount of deprivation can entirely extinguish. The religious life of an agri-world tends to be closely tied to the agricultural cycle. Our feast days coincide with planting and harvest, and the prayers offered in the small, simple chapels that serve the farming communities focus on themes of growth and fertility, and the blessings of rain and sunlight. The emperor is worshipped as a provider, as a guardian of the harvest, as the force that makes the crops grow and the rains fall. This is a gentler, more pastoral version of the imperial cult than the fire and brimstone variant practiced in the hive cities, and it reflects the different relationship that agricultural communities have with the natural world and with the divine. The work itself is physically demanding in the way that agricultural labor has always been, but magnified by the scale of imperial expectations. On some agri-worlds, the farming is done by hand, of vast armies of laborers toiling in the fields from dawn to dusk, with tools that would not look out of place in the medieval period. On others, enormous harvesting machines rumble across the landscape, their blades cutting swathes of grain a mile wide, operated by crews of technicians who live and work aboard the machines for months at a time, sleeping in cramped cabins and eating rations while the great machines never stop moving. Then there are the feudal worlds, and these are perhaps the most fascinating and tragic of all the Imperium's planet types, because the people who live on them often have no idea what they are a part of. A feudal world is defined as a planet whose population has developed a late Iron Age or early gunpowder civilization, technologically equivalent to medieval or Renaissance Earth. These worlds are populated by people who live under the rule of warrior aristocracies, who farm the land with plows and oxen, who fight their wars with swords and lances and perhaps primitive firearms. They live in castles and villages and towns. They worship the emperor, though they may know him by a different name and worship him in forms that would be unrecognizable to a citizen of Terra. They pay their tithes, though they may not understand exactly who they are paying them to or why. The Imperium deliberately keeps feudal worlds in their technologically primitive state. The planetary governor, who is often based on an orbital station rather than on the planet's surface to avoid disrupting the cultural balance, ensures that no advanced technology is introduced that might accelerate the population's development. This is done partly for practical reasons. Feudal worlders who are accustomed to obedience and hierarchy make excellent recruits for the Imperial Guard, and even for Space Marine chapters, and partly for reasons of control. A population that does not know about interstellar travel, that does not know about the full scope of the threats facing humanity, that believes the sky above them is the extent of creation, is a population that is easy to govern. They ask no awkward questions. They harbor no dangerous ambitions. They are content with their place in the order of things because they do not know that any other order of things is possible. There is something deeply unsettling about this, something that sits uncomfortably in the mind even when you understand the Imperium's justifications for it. Yeah, these are human beings who are deliberately kept in ignorance. Their entire understanding of reality carefully managed to serve the interests of a government they do not know exists. They live and die and love and fight and pray, all within a framework of understanding that is incomplete at best and actively false at worst. The stars above them are not points of light in a divine canopy. They are suns, orbited by planets. Some of those planets inhabited by aliens that would eat them or enslave them or do things to them that the human mind cannot fully comprehend. But they do not know this. They cannot know this. The Imperium has decided that ignorance is their protection, and whether or not that decision is correct, it is the decision that has been made. Civilized worlds represent the closest thing to a normal human existence that the Imperium has to offer. These are planets with populations roughly comparable to modern Earth, usually somewhere between 5 and 15 billion people, that possess a moderate level of technology and a functioning civilian infrastructure. They have cities, though not the towering megastructures of the hive worlds. They have industry, though not the continent-spanning factory complexes of forge worlds. They have agriculture, though not the planet-wide monocultures of agri-worlds. They are, in essence, balanced worlds, where people live something approaching ordinary lives. Life on a civilized world can be surprisingly similar to life in the modern developed world, at least on the surface. People work in offices and shops and factories. They live in houses and apartments. They raise families and attend religious services and participate in local governance. They have access to technology that, while it may seem archaic in some respects and impossibly advanced in others, serves the same basic functions that our technology serves: communication, transportation, manufacturing, medicine. But even on a civilized world, the weight of the Imperium bears down on every aspect of daily life. The imperial cult is still mandatory. The tithe must still be paid. The Arbites still maintain their fortified courthouses, watching for signs of heresy and rebellion. The black ships still come on their regular circuits, collecting psychers and hauling them away to an uncertain fate. And the shadow of war still looms over everything, because in the 41st millennium, no world is truly safe. No world is truly beyond the reach of the enemies that press in on the Imperium from every direction. The green tides of the Orcs, the inscrutable malice of the Eldar, the incomprehensible hunger of the Tyranids, the insidious corruption of chaos. All of these threats, and 100 more besides, are constant, eternal, and absolutely relentless. And then there are the worlds at the other end of the spectrum. Death worlds are planets where the environment itself is actively hostile to human life, where every plant and animal and geological feature seems designed to kill anyone foolish enough to set foot on the surface. Katakan is the most famous example, a jungle world where the vegetation itself is predatory, where insects the size of dogs hunt in packs through the undergrowth, where the very air can be toxic depending on which way the wind is blowing. The people who live on death worlds are survivors in the most primal sense of the word, hardened by a lifetime of constant struggle against an environment that gives nothing freely and takes everything it can. They make excellent soldiers, which is the primary reason the Imperium bothers to maintain colonies on such hostile planets. Life on a death world like Katakan is fundamentally different from life anywhere else in the Imperium. The concept of safety does not exist. There is no place on the planet where you can let your guard down, no building or bunker or shelter where you can be certain that something is not trying to find a way in to kill you. The jungle of Katakan is alive in a way that Earth's jungles are not. The trees move. The vines reach for you. Now, the flowers can blind you with toxic pollen or dissolve your flesh with acidic secretions. The animals range from swarms of tiny parasites that burrow into your skin and lay their eggs in your bloodstream to massive predators that can swallow a grown man whole and dissolve him in their stomachs over the course of days. The people of Katahan have adapted to this environment over thousands of years, developing physical and psychological traits that set them apart from the inhabitants of safer worlds. They are, on average, larger and stronger than the citizens of hive worlds, their bodies hardened by a lifetime of physical exertion in a high-gravity, high-humidity environment. Their reflexes are faster, their senses are sharper, their tolerance for pain is remarkable. They are also, by imperial standards, extraordinarily independent and self-reliant, traits that make them difficult to manage in formal military settings, but invaluable in the kind of small-unit warfare and jungle fighting at which they excel. Children on Katashan are not assigned to manufacturums or apprenticed to trades. They are trained to survive. From the moment they can walk, Katashan children are taught to identify and avoid the countless dangers that lurk in the jungle. They learn which plants are safe to touch and which will kill on contact. They learn to read the subtle signs that indicate the presence of predators, a particular kind of silence, a certain smell on the breeze, the way the undergrowth moves when something large and hungry is pushing through it. The mortality rate among Katahan children is staggeringly high. By some estimates, fewer than half of all children born on the planet survive to adulthood. Those who do survive are among the toughest human beings in the galaxy, and the Katakan jungle fighters are justly famous as one of the most formidable fighting forces in the Imperial Guard. But death worlds are not all jungle planets. Some are ice worlds, where temperatures plunge to levels that would freeze unprotected flesh in seconds, and where the winds can strip the skin from your bones. Others are volcanic worlds, where the ground shakes constantly and rivers of molten rock carve channels through landscapes of black basalt and poisonous gas. Some are ocean worlds, where the seas are filled with predators so enormous and so aggressive that no surface vessel can survive for more than a few hours. Yes, the common element is that the environment is actively trying to kill you, and the people who live in these environments have been shaped by that constant threat into something harder and more resilient than the average imperial citizen. Penal worlds deserve their own discussion because they represent another facet of civilian life in the Imperium. Specifically, what happens when your life as a civilian ends and you enter a category that is somewhere between citizen and non-person. A penal world is exactly what it sounds like, a planet that serves as a prison for the Imperium's criminals. The conditions on penal worlds are designed to punish rather than rehabilitate, and they make the harshest conditions on any other type of imperial world look comfortable by comparison. Prisoners on penal worlds are put to work in mines, in quarries, in factories, in whatever form of hard labor the world's administrators deem appropriate. The work is brutal, the hours are endless, the food is minimal, and the medical care is non-existent. The mortality rate on most penal worlds is measured in months rather than years, and the prisoners who survive longest are usually those who have formed the strongest alliances with other prisoners or who have managed to gain favor with the guards. There is no parole on a penal world. There is no time off for good behavior. There is no appeals process. Once you are sentenced to a penal world, you will remain there until you die, which will probably not take very long. The only escape is the Penal Legion, a branch of the Imperial Guard that recruits its soldiers from the prison population. Joining a penal legion is not an improvement in your circumstances. It is merely a change in the method of your eventual death, from slow attrition on a penal world to rapid destruction on a battlefield. But some prisoners volunteer for the penal legions anyway, preferring the quick death of combat to the slow death of exhaustion and deprivation. It is worth noting that not everyone on a penal world is a criminal by any reasonable definition. The Imperium's legal system, as we have discussed, is arbitrary and capricious, and the offences that can land you on a penal world include things that we would not consider crimes at all. Speaking against the ecclesiarchy, failing to meet production quotas, possessing unauthorized literature, being in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Inquisition is conducting an investigation. Where the line between citizen and criminal in the Imperium is thin and blurred, and it can be crossed at any moment, often without warning and without recourse. Now, in the interest of balance, let us acknowledge that not every world in the Imperium is a nightmare. There are places in the galaxy where human beings live lives that are, by the standards of the setting, remarkably good. And perhaps the best example of this is the realm of Ultramar. Ultramar is a collection of worlds in the Ultima Segmentum that serves as the domain of the Ultramarine Space Marine chapter. And, since the return of the Primarch Reboot Guilliman, as a model for what the Imperium could be if it were governed with competence and compassion rather than blind tradition and institutional cruelty. The worlds of Ultramar are beautiful by any standard.
Are well-maintained planets with clean environments, functioning infrastructure, and populations that enjoy a standard of living that would be the envy of most Imperial citizens. The people of Ultramar are still Imperial citizens, still subject to the demands of the tithe and the dictates of the Imperial cult. But they are governed by leaders who actually care about their welfare, who invest in education and healthcare and civil infrastructure, who maintain a justice system that is harsh but not arbitrary, and who treat their citizens as assets to be developed rather than resources to be consumed. The result is a population that is healthier, better educated, more productive, and more loyal than the populations of most other Imperial worlds. The military forces of Ultramar,
Both the Ultramarines themselves and the conventional armies raised from Ultramar's worlds, are among the finest in the Imperium, because they are drawn from a population that has something worth fighting for. Ultramar is proof that the suffering of the Imperium's citizens is not inevitable. It is proof that with competent governance and a genuine concern for the welfare of the people, it is possible to create something better within the framework of the Imperium's existing structures. And this, paradoxically, is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Imperium as a whole. Because if Ultramar can do it, if a handful of worlds in one corner of the galaxy can provide a decent standard of living for their people while still meeting their obligations to the Imperium, then the suffering of everyone else is not a necessary consequence of the galaxy's dangers. It is a choice made by leaders who could do better but do not, either because they do not care or because they have convinced themselves that misery is a virtue and that the suffering of the masses is somehow pleasing to the God Emperor. Guilliman himself, upon his return to the Imperium after 10,000 years, was reportedly appalled by what the civilization he had helped build had become. He remembered the Imperium of the Great Crusade, a human civilization that was far from perfect, but that had at least aspired to something better, that had been guided by a vision of a future in which humanity was free from the tyranny of ignorance and superstition. What he found instead was a theocratic nightmare, a civilization that had embraced the very things the Emperor had sought to destroy, and that had twisted the Emperor's legacy into a tool of oppression. Guilliman's efforts to reform the Imperium have been met with resistance from every quarter, from the ecclesiarchy, which sees his secular approach as a threat to their power, from the administratum, which views any change as a disruption to the system, and from the countless vested interests that benefit from the status quo and that will do anything to preserve it. Whether Guilliman's reforms will ultimately succeed, or whether the Imperium will continue on its slow, grinding descent into entropy and despair, is one of the great unanswered questions of the setting. But for the civilians of the Imperium, the fact that someone is trying,
or that someone with power and authority is genuinely attempting to make things better, is a source of hope that has been absent for 10,000 years. And in a universe where hope is the rarest commodity of all, that counts for something. Mining worlds are exactly what they sound like. planets whose primary purpose is the extraction of minerals and raw materials for the Imperium's industrial machine. Life on a mining world is labor, pure and simple. You work in the mines, you extract the ore, you process it, you load it onto transport ships, and then you go back into the mines and do it all over again. The conditions in Imperial mines make 19th century coal mines look like luxury resorts. Cave-ins, gas explosions, toxic exposure, and equipment failures are so common that they barely register as noteworthy. The life expectancy of a mining world laborer is measured in years, not decades. Forge worlds are the domain of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who worship the machine and whose understanding of technology is closer to religion than science. Life on a forge world is a thing apart from the rest of the Imperium, shaped by the Mechanicus' own particular brand of theology and social organization. The population of a forge world is divided between the tech priests, who form the ruling class, and the vast underclass of laborers and servitors who perform the actual work of manufacturing the Imperium's most advanced weapons and equipment. For the laborers, life on a forge world is a brutal grind of endless shifts in factories that produce everything from battle tanks to spacecraft components, and working alongside mindless servitors in conditions that would make a hive factory worker wince. The Adeptus Mechanicus is a strange and fascinating organization, one that deserves more attention than we can give it here. But it is important to understand something about how they view the people who work for them, because it affects every aspect of life on a forge world. The Mechanicus worships what they call the Omnissiah, the machine god, which they believe to be the ultimate expression of divine intelligence in the universe. Many tech priests identify the Omnissiah with the Emperor of mankind, though others insist that the machine god is a separate entity, a distinction that has been the source of considerable theological debate within the Mechanicus and considerable suspicion from the ecclesiarchy. What matters for our purposes is that the Mechanicus views flesh as weak and machines as sacred. The logical conclusion of this belief system is that the more you replace your organic body with mechanical components, the closer you come to the divine. For the rank-and-file tech priests, this means a gradual process of cybernetic augmentation that begins when they enter the Mechanicus' service and continues throughout their lives. A newly inducted tech priest might receive a simple bionic eye or a neural implant that allows them to interface with machine systems. Over time, as they advance in rank and undergo further modifications, they become less and less recognizably human, their flesh replaced piece by piece with metal and plastic and circuitry until they are more machine than person. As the most senior tech priests are often little more than brains suspended in mechanical bodies, their original human forms so thoroughly replaced that nothing organic remains except the neural tissue that houses their consciousness. For the laborers of a forge world, who are not tech priests and are not eligible for the higher grades of cybernetic augmentation, the implications of this philosophy are grim. The Mechanicus views them as biological components in a larger machine, valued for their function rather than their humanity. They are fed precisely calibrated nutrient compounds designed to maximize their energy output while minimizing waste. Their work schedules are calculated with mathematical precision, each minute of the day allocated to its optimal purpose. Their rest periods, their meals, and even their bathroom breaks are timed and monitored and adjusted according to algorithms that treat human endurance as a variable in an equation rather than a limit to be respected. The factories of a forge world are vast and terrifying, cathedral-like spaces where enormous machines perform operations of incredible precision under the supervision of tech priests who commune with the machine spirits through prayer and ritual. The air is thick with incense and the ozone-tinged smell of electrical discharge. The constant chanting of binary code, the sacred language of the Mechanicus, echoes from the walls and ceiling, a background hum that never stops, and that workers learn to ignore in the same way that hive workers learn to ignore the shift horn. Everything on a Forge world is ritualized. From the activation of a lathe to the calibration of a sensor array. Every action is accompanied by prayer. Every machine is blessed before it is used. Every product is consecrated before it is shipped. Workers on a Forge world who suffer injuries, and injuries are extremely common given the nature of the work and the scale of the machinery involved, are treated with the same mechanical pragmatism that characterizes everything the mechanicus does. If the injury can be repaired with a cybernetic replacement, the worker is modified and returned to their post. If the injury is too severe for repair, the worker is assessed for potential conversion into a servitor, their remaining organic components repurposed to create a new cybernetic drone. The concept of retirement does not exist on a Forge world. You work until you cannot work, and then you are recycled. The mechanicus wastes nothing. Let us also consider what happens to those who toil aboard the Imperium's great starships, for this is another form of civilian life that is seldom discussed, but that affects millions upon millions of people. The Imperium's void ships, the enormous vessels that carry troops and cargo and colonists across the galaxy, are not crewed by small teams of professional sailors in the way that modern ships are. They are crewed by thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of ordinary people who live and work and die aboard these vessels without ever setting foot on solid ground. A typical Imperial warship or transport vessel is enormous, kilometers in length, with internal volumes large enough to contain entire cities. The crews who operate these vessels are divided into rigid hierarchies, from the officers who command from the bridge to the lowest deckhands who perform the most menial and dangerous tasks in the ship's deepest compartments. Many crew members are born aboard ship and die aboard ship, their entire lives spent in the claustrophobic corridors and cramped quarters of a vessel that is constantly in motion, constantly vulnerable to the hazards of space travel and the particular horrors of transit through the warp. Life aboard an Imperial void ship is structured around the watch system, a rotation of duty shifts that keeps the ship's essential systems operating around the clock. The crew eats shipboard rations, which are generally even worse than the food available on a hive world, being designed for maximum shelf life and minimum cost, rather than any consideration of taste or nutritional variety. While water is recycled and rationed, air is filtered and recirculated. Privacy is virtually non-existent, with crew members sleeping in tiered bunks, stacked 4 or 5 high in dormitories that hold hundreds of people. The dangers of shipboard life are many and varied. Mechanical failures can vent compartments into the void, killing everyone inside in seconds. Fire is a constant threat in the enclosed spaces of a ship, and when fire breaks out, entire sections may be sealed off, and their inhabitants left to burn or suffocate to complete containment. Radiation leaks from the ship's reactors are not uncommon, and the long-term health effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure are evident in the pallid, unhealthy appearance of many veteran crew members. And then there is the warp. Travel through the warp. As the alternate dimension that makes faster-than-light travel possible is the most dangerous thing that an Imperial void ship and its crew can do. The warp is not merely a shortcut through space. It is a dimension of pure psychic energy, inhabited by entities that are drawn to human consciousness the way predators are drawn to prey. Imperial ships are protected by Geller fields, energy shields that create a bubble of real space around the vessel as it transits through the warp, keeping the demonic entities at bay. When the Geller field holds, warp travel is merely terrifying. The crew can feel the press of alien intelligence against the ship's hull, can hear whispers and see shadows that move at the edges of their vision. Nightmares are universal during warp transit, vivid and disturbing dreams that can leave even the most devout crew member shaken and questioning their sanity. When the Geller field fails, the result is catastrophic. Demonic entities pour into the ship, possessing the weak-willed, corrupting the vulnerable, and slaughtering the rest. Entire ships have been lost in the warp, their crews driven mad or consumed or transformed into something that is no longer human. The hulks of these lost vessels sometimes reappear centuries later, drifting out of the warp as space hulks, massive conglomerations of fused ships that are filled with the remnants of their original crews, now transformed by centuries of exposure to warp energies into things that barely qualify as alive. For the crew members who survive a career in the Imperial Void, the experience leaves its mark. They are haunted by what they have seen and heard and felt during their time in the warp. They carry the memories of friends who were lost, of compartments that were vented, of horrors that came aboard during Geller field fluctuations. They are changed, in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not, by a lifetime spent in an environment that is fundamentally hostile to human existence and human sanity. And yet the ships keep flying, the crews keep serving, the trade routes keep operating, because without them, the Imperium would die. The ships that carry food from agri-worlds to hive worlds, that transport troops from recruitment centers to war zones, that carry the orders and communications that hold a million worlds together in a semblance of unity. These ships and their crews are as essential to the Imperium's survival as any army or any weapon. They are the circulatory system of a galactic civilization, and the people who operate them are the blood cells, individually insignificant, but collectively indispensable. Let us also speak about the nature of childhood in the Imperium, because to understand what it means to be a civilian in the 41st millennium, you must understand how that civilization shapes its people from the very beginning. On most imperial worlds, childhood as we understand it does not exist. The concept of a protected period of development, during which children are shielded from the harsh realities of adult life and allowed to grow and learn at their own pace, is a luxury that the Imperium cannot afford and does not recognize. Whilst children in the Imperium are small adults, expected to contribute to the household and to the community from the moment they are physically capable of doing so. On hive worlds, children begin working in the manufactorums as young as 6 or 7 standard years, performing tasks that require small hands and flexible bodies, crawling into spaces that adult workers cannot reach, cleaning delicate machinery, sorting components on assembly lines. On agri-worlds, children work in the fields alongside their parents, carrying water and pulling weeds and doing the 1,000 small tasks that agricultural life demands. On forge worlds, the children of the laboring class are apprenticed to their parents' trades almost from birth, their entire lives mapped out before they are old enough to understand what a life is. But the exception to this pattern is the Schola Progenium, the orphanage system run by the ecclesiarchy that raises the children of imperial servants who have died in the line of duty. The Schola provides the closest thing to a formal education that the Imperium offers to its common citizens, but it is education in the imperial mode, heavily focused on religious indoctrination, military discipline, and unquestioning obedience to authority. The children of the Schola are taught to read and write, to perform basic mathematics, to recite the catechisms of the imperial creed, and to handle weapons. They are taught that the emperor is their father, that the Imperium is their family, and that their purpose in life is to serve both with absolute devotion. The most promising students are selected for careers in the Adeptus Terra, the Commissariat, or the Adepta Sororitas, or other imperial organizations. The rest are assigned to whatever role the Imperium requires, soldiers or scribes or laborers, their futures decided for them by officials who have never met them, and who view them as entries in a ledger rather than individuals with dreams and desires of their own. For children who are not fortunate enough, if that is the right word, to be raised in the Schola, education is whatever their community can provide. On some civilized worlds, there are schools of a sort, run by local authorities or by the ecclesiarchy, where children learn basic literacy and numeracy along with their mandatory religious instruction. On most other worlds, education is informal, practical, and focused entirely on survival. You learn what you need to know to do the work that your community requires. Anything beyond that is considered unnecessary and, in some cases, potentially dangerous. A worker who thinks too much is a worker who asks questions, and questions are the first step on the road to heresy. The emotional landscape of childhood in the Imperium is shaped by these conditions. Children grow up knowing that their lives are not their own, that they exist to serve a purpose defined by others, that the concept of choice is something that applies to their betters, but not to them. They grow up in an atmosphere of constant surveillance and constant judgment, where a wrong word or a wrong look can attract the attention of the ecclesiarchy's priests, or the Arbites, or worst of all, the Inquisition. They learn early that curiosity is dangerous, that imagination is suspect, and that the safest course of action is always to keep your head down, do your work, say your prayers, and hope that nobody notices you. And yet, because they are children, and because children are by nature resilient and inventive and irrepressible, they find ways to be children despite everything. They play games in the corridors of their hab blocks, chasing each other through the labyrinthine passageways, making up rules and keeping score in ways that adults can never quite follow. They form friendships that are fierce and loyal and occasionally violent, alliances forged in the shared experience of growing up in a world that does not care about their well-being. They create secret languages and hidden symbols, private codes that allow them to communicate without adults understanding, or small acts of rebellion that assert their individuality in a system designed to erase it. They dream despite everything. They dream about the spires and the stars and the worlds beyond their reach, about lives they will never live and freedoms they will never know. And sometimes, just sometimes, those dreams give them the strength to survive another day. Shrine worlds are planets dedicated entirely to religious observance, their surfaces covered with temples and cathedrals and monuments to the Emperor and his saints. These are pilgrimage destinations, places where the faithful travel from across the sector to worship at sacred sites and venerate holy relics. Life on a shrine world revolves around the ecclesiarchy's calendar of festivals and observances, and the permanent population consists mainly of priests, monks, nuns, and the support staff required to maintain the planet's religious infrastructure and accommodate the constant stream of pilgrims. Paradise worlds are the rarest and most coveted of all imperial planet types, worlds of exceptional natural beauty and clement climate that are reserved for the use of the Imperium's elite. These are resort worlds, vacation destinations for the wealthy and powerful, places where the nobility of the spires go to escape the pollution and overcrowding of their home worlds and experience something approaching the natural beauty that humanity once took for granted. The permanent population of a paradise world is usually small, consisting of the servants and support staff who maintain the planet's facilities for their wealthy visitors. For most imperial citizens, a paradise world is nothing more than a rumor, and a legend, a story told by someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who once met a person who had actually been there. The idea that there are worlds where the air is sweet and the water is clean and the sun shines warm on green fields and blue oceans is, for the average hive worker, as fantastical and unbelievable as any fairy tale. Now, let us talk about the machine that holds all of this together, the vast and creaking bureaucracy that somehow manages to govern 1 million worlds and a population that numbers in the quadrillions. The Adeptus Administratum is, in its simplest terms, the Imperium's civil service. It is the administrative and bureaucratic division of the Adeptus Terra, the central government of the Imperium, and it is responsible for everything from collecting taxes to maintaining census records to organizing the logistics of the Imperial Guard. It is the largest organization in the Imperium, employing uncountable billions of clerks, scribes, administrators, and functionaries who work ceaselessly to keep the machinery of government running. The administratum's primary method of record-keeping is parchment. In a galaxy where faster-than-light communication exists but is unreliable and expensive, where electronic records can be corrupted by warp interference, and where the traditions of 10,000 years carry the weight of religious commandment, the administratum keeps its records on vellum. Mountains of parchment, produced from the hides of animals bred on agri-worlds or grown in biovats, and are consumed every day by the administratum's legions of scribes who sit at their desks in enormous vaults and write out documents by hand using quills and ink. Vellum is, reportedly, the 7th largest import to Terra by weight, which tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the Imperium's paperwork. The administratum is aware that this system is inefficient. There have been proposals over the millennia to modernize, to adopt electronic record-keeping, to streamline the bureaucratic process. These proposals have been rejected again and again because tradition is the Imperium's most powerful force. The administratum has operated on parchment for 10,000 years. To change now would be to suggest that the way things have always been done is wrong, which is dangerously close to suggesting that the Emperor's design is flawed, which is heresy. And so the scribes continue to write, and the parchment continues to pile up, and the bureaucracy continues to grind forward with all the speed and efficiency of a glacier. For the average imperial citizen, interaction with the administratum is a source of frustration and dread in roughly equal measure. Every aspect of your life is documented somewhere in the administratum's records, from your birth to your assigned occupation, to your tithe obligations, to your eventual death. Your tax records, your work history, your medical records, your family history, all of it is written down on parchment and filed away in some vast archive, where it will probably be lost or misfiled or accidentally eaten by rodents within a few decades. The bureaucratic errors of the administratum are legendary and terrifying because the system relies on manual record-keeping across millions of worlds, connected by unreliable interstellar communications. Mistakes are not just common, they are inevitable. Rounding errors in tithe calculations have led to worlds being declared traitors and subjected to military intervention over debts they never actually owed. Clerical mistakes have resulted in Imperial Guard regiments being sent to the wrong war zone, or being issued supplies intended for a completely different army, or being recorded as wiped out when they are in fact still very much alive and in desperate need of reinforcement. Entire planets have been lost in the records, their existence forgotten by the administratum for centuries at a time. Their populations abandoned and left to fend for themselves until some clerk stumbles across their file and realizes that they should probably send someone to check in. Many administratum positions are hereditary, passed down from parent to child across generations. The son of a scribe becomes a scribe. The daughter of an archivist becomes an archivist. Entire family lines have been employed in the same department of the administratum for centuries, performing the same tasks, sitting at the same desks, using the same equipment. Their lives and their descendants' lives mapped out in advance with the same precision and the same inevitability as the orbits of planets around their stars. Planetary governance is, in theory, a matter of considerable local autonomy. The Imperium's central government on Terra sets the broad parameters within which worlds must operate. Pay your tithe, worship the Emperor, do not traffic with aliens or heretics. Beyond these basic requirements, planetary governors are free to organize their worlds however they see fit. Some govern as benevolent autocrats, investing in their planet's infrastructure and welfare. Others govern as rapacious tyrants, extracting every possible resource from their populations and enriching themselves at the expense of everyone around them. Some planets have developed democratic systems of governance, holding elections and maintaining legislative bodies. Others operate as feudal monarchies or corporate oligarchies or military dictatorships. The Imperium does not care how a world is governed, yet so long as the tithe is paid and the Emperor is worshipped. A planetary governor could be a saint or a monster,
and it would make no difference to the distant bureaucrats on Terra, provided the world's output meets the required standards. This hands-off approach to governance is both the Imperium's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allows for an extraordinary diversity of human cultures and political systems to exist within a single imperial framework, which provides a kind of resilience that a more centralized system would lack. But it also means that billions of people can be condemned to lives of terrible suffering under tyrannical rulers, and the Imperium will do nothing about it as long as the numbers on the tithe ledger balance out. The tithe itself is the central mechanism by which the Imperium extracts value from its member worlds. Every inhabited planet in the Imperium owes a tithe to Terra, a regular payment in the form of goods, resources, or personnel that is calculated by the Administratum based on the world's classification, population, and productive capacity. The tithe can take many forms. Agri-worlds pay their tithe in food. Forge worlds pay in manufactured goods. Mining worlds pay in raw materials. Hive worlds pay in everything: manufactured products, raw manpower for the Imperial Guard, and the endless other necessities that the Imperium's war machine requires. The tithe system creates a web of economic interdependence that spans the galaxy. No world in the Imperium is truly self-sufficient. Hive worlds need food from agri-worlds. Agri-worlds need manufactured goods from hive worlds and forge worlds. Forge worlds need raw materials from mining worlds. Everyone needs soldiers from everywhere. This interdependence is both the Imperium's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. It means that the failure of a single link in the chain, the destruction of a key agri-world, the fall of a critical forge world, can have cascading effects that are felt across an entire sector. It means that the disruption of shipping routes, whether by enemy action or by warp storms, or simply by the endemic incompetence of the Administratum's logistics division, can cause famine and shortage on worlds that were perfectly productive until the supply ships stopped arriving. Let us consider for a moment the practical economics of civilian life in the Imperium, because this is something that the grand narratives of war and faith tend to overlook, but that determines the shape of everyday existence for trillions of people. Currency in the Imperium is wildly inconsistent. There is no single galactic currency that is accepted everywhere. Instead, each world, and sometimes each city or each district within a city, has its own monetary system. Some worlds use physical coins minted from various metals. Others use credit systems administered by local banks or guilds. Others operate primarily on barter, particularly in the lower levels of hive cities and in the underhive, where formal currency has little meaning and everything is measured in terms of what you can trade and what you can offer. On some worlds, as the unit of currency has specific names that have accumulated centuries of cultural significance. In the tabletop role-playing game set in the Imperium's universe, players are paid in solars, a unit that has roughly comparable purchasing power to our own currencies for basic goods. A backpack might cost around 20 solars. A meal at a cheap eatery might cost a few. A weapon, depending on quality and legality, might cost anywhere from tens to thousands. But for most Imperial citizens, the concept of disposable income is largely theoretical. The vast majority of what a worker earns goes to the basic necessities of survival: food, shelter, and the various fees and taxes that are levied by the local authorities and by the Imperium's tithe system. What remains after these obligations are met is usually barely enough to purchase the small luxuries that make life marginally bearable: a cup of recaf, a bottle of rotgut, a few hours at a communal entertainment venue. Trade between worlds is conducted by a variety of entities, from the great merchant houses and rogue trader dynasties that operate fleets of cargo vessels across the sector, to the smaller independent traders who ply the routes between neighboring systems in ships that are barely spaceworthy and crews that are barely sober. The goods that move along these trade routes are extraordinarily diverse. Food from agri-worlds, manufactured products from hive worlds and forge worlds, raw materials from mining worlds, luxury items from paradise worlds, religious artifacts from shrine worlds,
weapons and ammunition from every world that produces them. The risks of interstellar trade are enormous. Ships can be lost in the warp, attacked by pirates or Xenos raiders, or simply arrive so late that the goods they carry have spoiled or become obsolete. Insurance, to the extent that it exists, is provided by the great merchant guilds and is available only to those who can afford the premiums. Smaller traders operate without any safety net, gambling everything on each voyage, knowing that a single disaster can wipe out a lifetime of accumulated wealth. For the citizens of a world that depends on imported goods, the arrival of a trade fleet is a major event. On hive worlds, the docking of a food transport from an agri-world is cause for something approaching celebration, or at least relief, among the lower hive population, who know that their rations will be replenished and that the spectre of shortage will be held at bay for another few months. The delay or absence of an expected supply shipment, on the other hand, is cause for alarm that can quickly escalate into panic and then into violence. Necromunda, for instance, is said to be only ever one missed shipment away from utter anarchy, a statement that is probably an exaggeration, but that captures the fundamental precariousness of life on a world that cannot feed itself. Rogue traders occupy a unique position in the Imperium's economic and social structure. These are individuals or families who have been granted a warrant of trade by the Emperor himself, a document that gives them the authority to trade with alien species, explore uncharted regions of space, and generally operate outside the normal constraints of imperial law. Rogue traders are part explorer, part merchant, part privateer, and part diplomat, and their activities at the fringes of the Imperium often have consequences that ripple back through civilian life in unexpected ways. A rogue trader who discovers a new agri-world can change the food supply of an entire sector. One who opens a new trade route can bring prosperity to worlds that were previously struggling to meet their tithe obligations. One who inadvertently leads an enemy force back to imperial space can bring devastation to worlds that thought they were safe. For the average citizen, rogue traders are figures of legend, people who live lives of unimaginable freedom and adventure in a universe where freedom and adventure are in dangerously short supply. And the stories that circulate about rogue traders in the hab blocks and the taverns of hive worlds are probably at least 90% fabrication, but they serve an important psychological function. They remind people that somewhere out there, beyond the walls of the hive and the fields of the agri-world and the factories of the forge world, there are people who are genuinely free. And the existence of that freedom, however distant and however unattainable, is enough to keep the flame of hope alive in hearts that might otherwise surrender entirely to despair. Let us also discuss the matter of healthcare in the Imperium in more detail, because the state of medical care available to the average citizen tells you a great deal about the value that the Imperium places on human life. On the most developed worlds, yet in the spires of hive cities and on the more prosperous civilized worlds, medical care can be quite advanced. The wealthy have access to juvenat treatments, medical procedures that can slow or partially reverse the aging process, extending natural lifespans well beyond what we would consider normal. Some noble families maintain personal physicians who are trained in the most advanced medical techniques available, capable of performing surgeries and administering treatments that would be considered miraculous by our standards. Cybernetic augmentation is available for those who can afford it, replacing damaged or failing organs with mechanical alternatives that can function as well as, or better than, the originals. But for the vast majority of imperial citizens, medical care is rudimentary at best. The Officio Medicae operates clinics and hospitals on many worlds, but these facilities are chronically understaffed and undersupplied, and the quality of care they provide varies enormously depending on the competence of the individual practitioners and the resources available to them. On hive worlds, the Medicae facilities in the lower levels are often little more than triage stations, places where the most severe injuries are treated with whatever materials are on hand and where less serious conditions are simply ignored because there is neither the time nor the resources to address them. The concept of preventive medicine does not exist in most parts of the Imperium. There are no public health campaigns encouraging exercise or healthy eating. There are no vaccination programs protecting against common diseases. There are no routine checkups or screenings. Medical care in the Imperium is reactive rather than proactive. You get treatment when something goes wrong, and even then, only if the condition is severe enough to warrant the expenditure of limited medical resources. Minor injuries and illnesses are expected to be endured without complaint. Chronic conditions are simply part of life, managed through willpower and prayer rather than through medical intervention. Prosthetics, as we have mentioned, are widely available but of highly variable quality. The crude mechanical replacements that are fitted to injured hive workers bear no resemblance to the sophisticated cybernetic limbs that the wealthy can afford, or that the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus install in their own bodies. A working-class prosthetic is a functional tool, designed to allow the worker to continue performing their assigned tasks. Nothing more. It provides no sensation, no fine motor control, no cosmetic approximation of the original limb. It is a piece of machinery attached to a body, and it is treated with the same pragmatic indifference that the Imperium applies to all of its machinery. Mental health care does not exist in any meaningful sense. As we discussed in the context of post-war trauma, the Imperium does not recognize psychological distress as a medical condition. Anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, all of these are viewed not as illnesses to be treated, but as spiritual weaknesses to be overcome through faith and discipline. The ecclesiarchy's priests serve as the closest thing the Imperium has to mental health professionals, offering counsel and prayer to those who are struggling, but their advice is always the same. Trust in the Emperor, work harder, pray more. Your suffering is the Emperor's will, and to reject your suffering is to reject the Emperor. This approach to mental health has predictable consequences. Rates of addiction, self-harm, and violence are staggeringly high across the Imperium, particularly in the most overcrowded and deprived environments. Substance abuse is endemic in the lower levels of hive cities, where workers turn to alcohol and narcotics to cope with conditions that would break the strongest mind. Domestic violence is common, fueled by stress and frustration and the complete absence of any constructive outlet for negative emotions. Suicide, while never officially acknowledged as a widespread problem, is prevalent enough that most Hablock residents can name someone they know who has taken their own life. The Imperium's indifference to the mental health of its citizens is not merely callous. It is, within the context of the Imperium's reality, a deliberate strategic choice. A population that is too happy, too comfortable, too content with its circumstances is a population that might start asking questions about why things have to be this way. A certain level of misery keeps people grateful for what they have and afraid of losing it. A certain level of despair makes the promises of the imperial cult, the promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering, more compelling and more necessary. The Imperium needs its people to be just miserable enough to obey, but not so miserable that they rebel. It is a delicate balance, and it is maintained through a combination of religious indoctrination, economic exploitation, and the carefully calibrated application of fear. For the average citizen, the tithe is an abstraction, something that affects their lives profoundly, but that they have no control over and no voice in determining. You do not get to vote on how much your world owes to the Imperium. You do not get to appeal the assessment if you believe it is unfair. You simply work, and the fruits of your labor are taken from you and shipped to places you will never see, to serve purposes you will never understand. This is the fundamental transaction of civilian life in the Imperium. Your labor for the privilege of continuing to exist. Now let us talk about what happens when the systems that maintain order in this precarious civilization break down. Let us talk about law and punishment, because the Imperium's approach to justice tells you as much about civilian life as anything else. The primary enforcers of imperial law are the Adeptus Arbites, an organization that functions as a combination of federal police force, court system, and military garrison all rolled into one. The Arbites are not local cops. They do not investigate petty crimes, or patrol neighborhoods, or help lost children find their parents. That sort of thing is handled by planetary enforcers, local police forces that vary enormously in quality and methods from world to world. The Arbites are concerned with a higher class of crime, the kind that threatens the stability of the Imperium itself. Sedition, treason, disruption of the tithe, unsanctioned psychic activity, and any form of heresy or alien contamination. The Arbites operate from fortified precinct fortresses, buildings that look less like police stations and more like military bunkers, with thick armored walls, extensive armories, secure detention cells, and courtrooms where guilt and punishment are determined with a speed and finality that would astonish anyone accustomed to a modern legal system. An Arbites officer, called an arbitrator, has the authority to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the field. There is no right to a trial. There is no right to legal representation. There is no right to appeal. If an arbitrator determines that you have broken imperial law, they can sentence you and execute that sentence on the spot. The legal concept of presumed innocence does not exist in the Imperium. You are guilty until proven otherwise, and the burden of proof rests entirely on you. Whilst the Lex Imperialis, the body of law that the Arbites enforce, is thousands of years old and, in places, monumentally irrational, laws that made sense in a specific historical context have been preserved, unchanged across millennia. Their original purpose long forgotten, but their enforcement still rigidly maintained. It is, under certain circumstances, as much a crime to be the victim of a kidnapping as it is to be the kidnapper. The reasoning behind this law, if there ever was any, has been lost to time. But the law remains, and the Arbites enforce it, because the Arbites do not question the law. They enforce it. That is their only function and their only purpose. The punishments available to the Arbites are brutal and diverse. For minor infractions, public lashing or corporal punishment may suffice. For more serious crimes, but the penalties escalate rapidly. Execution, either by bolt or by burning, is the most common punishment for any crime that the Arbites deem serious enough to warrant their attention. Conscription into a penal legion of the Imperial Guard is another common sentence, a delayed death sentence that sends the condemned to fight on the most dangerous battlefields in the galaxy with minimal equipment and no expectation of survival. Assignment to a penal world, where conditions are designed to punish rather than rehabilitate, is reserved for those whose crimes are serious but whose bodies are still useful for manual labor. And then there is servitorization. A servitor, as we briefly touched upon earlier, is a cybernetic construct created from a fusion of human flesh and robotic technology. Servitors are used throughout the Imperium to perform dangerous, repetitive, or menial tasks that would otherwise require either a human worker or, in a civilization that did not have a religious prohibition against artificial intelligence, a robot. The Imperium does have that prohibition, a deep and enduring fear of machine intelligence that dates back to a catastrophic event in humanity's distant past known as the Age of Strife, when rebellious artificial intelligences turned against their human creators with devastating consequences. Rather than risk creating another artificial intelligence, the Imperium creates servitors, lobotomizing human brains and fitting them with cybernetic control systems to produce something that functions like a robot but is technically still organic. Many servitors are created from vat-grown clones, genetically engineered blanks that have never possessed consciousness in the way that a natural-born human does. But many others are created from living people, criminals who have been sentenced to servitorization as punishment for their crimes, or simply unfortunate individuals who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when a tech priest needed raw material. The process involves the partial or complete removal of the subject's higher brain functions, the installation of cybernetic control systems, and the grafting of whatever mechanical components are required for the servitor's intended function. The result is a being that can follow simple commands, perform repetitive tasks, and respond to basic stimuli, but that possesses no self-awareness, no personality, no memories, and no capacity for independent thought. In theory. In practice, there are documented cases of servitors retaining fragments of their former consciousness, residual memories or behaviors that surface unexpectedly and disturbingly. Some servitors have been observed to whisper phrases or display emotional responses that suggest some part of the person they once were is still present, trapped inside a body that has been modified beyond recognition, aware on some level of what has been done to them, but unable to communicate or resist. The Adeptus Mechanicus considers this a malfunction rather than a moral problem. The tech priests who create servitors do not, as a rule, concern themselves with the philosophical implications of their work. The machine must function. If it functions correctly, the work is good. If it malfunctions, it is repaired or replaced. The question of whether the raw material suffered in the process is simply not one that they consider relevant. The existence of servitors is perhaps the single most disturbing feature of civilian life in the Imperium, not because of what it says about the technology or the theology, but because of what it says about the value that the Imperium places on individual human life. In the Imperium, a human being is a resource. You are valued for what you can produce, for the labor you can perform, for the tithe you can contribute. If you cease to be useful in your current form, you can be repurposed. If you break the law, you can be converted from a citizen into a tool. The servitor that loads crates in a warehouse, the servitor that cleans the corridors of a spacecraft, or the servitor that carries ammunition for an Imperial Guard artillery piece. Any of these might once have been a person with a name and a family and hopes and fears. Now they are machines, and nobody remembers what they were before. This, more than anything else, is what defines civilian life in the Imperium of man. Not the wars, not the aliens, not the demons, but the fundamental understanding, absorbed from birth and reinforced every day through every institution and every interaction, that your life has value only insofar as it serves the Imperium, and that the moment it ceases to serve the Imperium, it can be taken from you without ceremony, without regret, and without anyone noticing that you are gone. Let us now talk about what happens when war, the Imperium's constant companion and defining characteristic, comes directly to the doorstep of ordinary people. For the vast majority of Imperial citizens, war is something that happens somewhere else. It is a distant rumble, a headline in a propaganda broadcast, a reason why your rations have been reduced, or why your neighbor's son was taken away by the recruitment officers and never came back. The Imperium's wars are fought on a scale so vast that most people cannot comprehend them, across distances so enormous that the events on one front are completely unknown to the people on another. A civilization-ending battle might be raging in a sector of the galaxy 10,000 light-years from where you live, and you would know nothing about it unless someone told you. And even if they did tell you, the information would be so far removed from your daily experience that it would seem almost fictional, and a story about events happening to people you have never met in places you could never reach. But sometimes, war comes to you, and when it does, there is nothing in civilian experience that can prepare you for it. The Imperium faces threats from every direction. Orc hordes surge out of the galactic fringe in waves of green-skinned fury, their savage battle cries echoing across planetary surfaces as they tear through defensive lines with nothing more than crude weapons and overwhelming numbers. The orcs do not invade for territory or resources in any strategic sense. They invade because fighting is what they are. It is the fundamental purpose of their existence, encoded into their biology at the most basic level. When the orcs come to your world, they do not negotiate. They do not make demands. They simply kill everything they can reach, and they enjoy doing it. An orc invasion is a catastrophe of biblical proportions for any civilian population caught in its path. The initial assault is typically preceded by a period of increasing raids and skirmishes, as Orc scouts and outriders probe the planet's defenses, testing for weaknesses, gauging the strength of the opposition. Then, the main force arrives, usually in vast space hulks or crudely constructed but terrifyingly effective warships, and the real nightmare begins. Orc armies advance in great green tides, millions of savage warriors surging across the landscape, demolishing everything in their path with the brute force of sheer numbers and the manic energy that characterizes everything the Orcs do. For civilians, the options during an Orc invasion are limited and uniformly terrible. And if the planetary defense forces are strong enough, the civilian population may be evacuated to fortified positions or underground bunkers where they can wait out the fighting. If the invasion is large enough, conscription is almost certain, with every able-bodied adult pressed into service in the planetary defense militia and handed whatever weapons are available, from proper lasguns to improvised clubs and farming implements. If the planetary defenses fail entirely, the choice becomes simple: flee or die. Chaos invasions are different, and in many ways, worse. Where the Orcs are straightforward in their violence, the forces of chaos are insidious. A chaos incursion often begins not with an overt military assault, but with corruption from within, cults that have been worming their way into the population for years or even generations, are slowly spreading their influence until the fabric of society itself begins to unravel. People who were once loyal citizens begin to hear voices that whisper seductive promises of power and freedom. Religious observances that once brought comfort begin to feel hollow and empty, replaced by a creeping sense that there is something else out there, something more real and more immediate than the distant and silent emperor on his golden throne. By the time a chaos invasion becomes overt, much of the damage has already been done. The population is divided between the loyal and the corrupted, and it is often impossible to tell which is which. Neighbors turn on each other. Families are torn apart. The very concept of trust evaporates in an atmosphere of paranoia and accusation. And then the demons come, entities of pure malice drawn from the hellish dimension of the warp, creatures that exist partially outside the rules of physical reality and that can twist flesh and warp minds and turn the landscape itself into something alien and terrible. For civilians caught in a chaos incursion, the psychological horror is often worse than the physical danger. You cannot fight an enemy that exists inside your own head. You cannot defend against whispers that come from nowhere and offer everything you have ever wanted in exchange for everything you have ever been. The Imperium's response to chaos incursions is typically extreme. Entire populations may be subjected to mass interrogation by the Inquisition, with anyone even suspected of corruption being executed or subjected to worse. Worlds that are deemed too corrupted to save may be subjected to exterminatus, the deliberate and total destruction of all life on a planet's surface through the use of virus bombs, cyclonic torpedoes, or other weapons of mass destruction. There is another threat that touches civilian life in a way that is perhaps even more insidious than chaos, because it wears the face of everything the Imperium values. The Genestealer cults are alien infiltration networks that burrow into human societies like parasites, slowly corrupting the population from within until the time is right for them to strike. The process begins when a single Genestealer, an advanced organism of the Tyrannid hive fleets, makes its way onto a human world and begins to spread its genetic taint through contact with the local population. Those who are infected do not know what has happened to them. They return to their normal lives, but they carry within them an alien influence that subtly reshapes their thoughts and desires, making them loyal not to the Emperor, but to the alien presence that has claimed them. The infected individuals reproduce, and their children are born with the Genestealer's genetic material woven into their DNA. These children look different from normal humans, their features bearing the mark of alien contamination, but they are raised in secret, hidden from the authorities by their devoted parents, who see in them not corruption, but a kind of holiness. Over the course of generations, the cult grows, its members occupying positions throughout civilian society, from the factory floors to the guilds to the planetary government itself. They wait, are patient and silent, worshipping the alien presence they call the Patriarch as a divine being, preparing for the day when the hive fleet arrives and the final transformation begins. For the ordinary civilians who are not part of the cult, the infiltration is invisible. Their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends, even their family members might be cult members, and they would never know. The cults are extraordinarily good at maintaining their cover, presenting themselves as loyal imperial citizens, attending religious services, paying their tithes, doing everything that is expected of them while secretly working to undermine the society they inhabit. By the time the cult's presence is discovered, it is usually too late. The cult has spread too far, its tendrils reaching into every level of the planet's social structure. And the only solution is the same brutal calculus that the Imperium applies to every threat: contain and destroy, regardless of the cost to the civilian population. The Genestealer cult threat is particularly horrifying because it attacks the one thing that keeps Imperial civilian life bearable: trust. The bonds of family, friendship, and community that sustain people through the grinding hardship of their daily lives become weapons in the hands of the cult, tools for spreading its influence and concealing its presence. When a cult is finally exposed, the aftermath is devastating, not just because of the physical violence that follows, but because of the psychological damage inflicted on a population that can no longer trust the people around them. If your own mother could have been a Genestealer cultist, then who can you trust? Yet if the man who shared his rations with you during the last food shortage was secretly working to bring about the end of everything you know, then what basis do you have for trusting anyone ever again? This is the particular cruelty of the Genestealer cults. They do not merely threaten the body, they threaten the soul, not in the spiritual sense that the ecclesiarchy uses the word, but in the deeper, more fundamental sense of the social connections and mutual trust that make human life possible. They turn the strengths of human community into vulnerabilities, and they leave behind a population that is not merely diminished, but fundamentally broken in ways that are far more difficult to repair than bombed-out buildings or devastated farmland. The world of Cadia deserves particular mention in any discussion of civilian life in the Imperium, because before its destruction, it represented one of the most extreme examples of how war can shape every aspect of civilian existence. Cadia sat at the edge of the Eye of Terror, the great wound in reality through which the forces of chaos pour into the material universe. For 10,000 years, the Cadians had lived in the shadow of that cosmic horror, and it had made them what they were: a planet of soldiers, a world where every civilian was also a warrior, where military service was not a duty imposed from above, but a cultural identity embraced from birth. On Cadia, the line between civilian and soldier did not exist in any meaningful sense. Every citizen was trained in the use of weapons and in military tactics from early childhood. The school system was, in essence, a military academy, producing graduates who were ready for service in the planet's legendary shock troops. The culture of the planet revolved around military preparedness, military honor, and the understanding that the next chaos invasion could come at any moment, and that when it came, every man, woman, and child would be expected to fight. The life of a Cadian civilian was structured around this reality. Work was organized with military efficiency. Housing was designed to double as defensive positions. The streets of Cadian cities were laid out with clear fields of fire and defensible choke points. Even the food was designed with combat in mind. Ration packs that provided maximum nutrition in minimum weight, easy to carry into a bunker or a trench when the alarm sounded. And the alarms sounded often. Cadia was attacked by the forces of chaos repeatedly throughout its history, most notably during the 13 Black Crusades launched by the Warmaster Abaddon. Each of these attacks tested the Cadians to their limits and beyond, and each time the Cadians held their discipline and their courage and their sheer stubbornness, turning back invasions that should have been unstoppable. Until the 13th Black Crusade, when they could hold no longer. Cardia fell. The planet itself was destroyed, broken apart by the forces unleashed during the final battle. Billions of Cadians died with their world, but many survived, evacuated to other worlds before the end, carrying with them the culture and the traditions and the iron determination that had made Cardia legendary. The surviving Cadians settled on new worlds, established new communities, and continued to serve the Imperium with the same unwavering dedication that had defined their planet for 10,000 years. The destruction of Cardia is one of the defining events of the current era of the Imperium, and its impact on civilian life across the galaxy has been profound. For many Imperial citizens, Cardia was a symbol, proof that even at the edge of the abyss, human courage could prevail. Its fall shook the faith of billions, not in the Emperor necessarily, but in the Imperium's ability to protect its people. If Cardia could fall, then nowhere was safe. If the greatest fortress world in the galaxy could be destroyed, then what hope was there for the ordinary hive worker, or the agri-world laborer, or the feudal serf who had always been told that the Imperium would stand forever? The answer, as it always is in the Imperium, was faith. The ecclesiarchy mobilized its vast resources to reframe the fall of Cardia, not as a defeat, but as a sacrifice, a martyrdom on a planetary scale that proved the devotion of the Cadians and that would be rewarded in the Emperor's own time. The message was clear. Cardia stands, even though the planet does not. The spirit of the fortress world lives on in its survivors and in the hearts of all who believe. And while this message was, in many ways, propaganda designed to prevent panic and maintain order, it was also, for many people, genuinely comforting. Because in a universe where planets can be destroyed, and galaxies can be split in half, and gods of chaos can reach into the material world and twist reality to suit their whims, the idea that the human spirit can endure, that courage and faith and determination can survive even the death of a world, is not just a platitude. It is a necessity. Without it, there would be nothing left to fight for. Exterminatus is the Imperium's final solution to a world that has been lost to the enemy, and it is used more often than most Imperial citizens would be comfortable knowing. The decision to destroy a world and its entire population, billions of human beings reduced to ash and vapor in the space of hours, is made by individuals who believe, sincerely and absolutely, that they are doing the right thing. Better to destroy one world than to let the corruption spread to others. Better to kill billions than to risk trillions. The mathematics of Exterminatus are cold and simple, and they are the mathematics by which the Imperium has survived for 10,000 years. Tyrannid invasions represent yet another form of horror, one that is so far removed from normal human experience that the mind struggles to process it. The Tyrannids are not an army. They are not even an enemy in the conventional sense. They are a force of nature, a vast and hungry biological machine that strips worlds of all organic matter with a terrifying efficiency that defies comprehension. When a Tyrannid hive fleet descends on a world, it does not come to conquer. It comes to consume. Every living thing on the planet, every blade of grass, every insect, every drop of water, every microscopic organism in the soil is devoured and absorbed into the hive fleet's biomass. When the Tyrannids leave, there is nothing left. The planet is a barren rock, stripped of its atmosphere, its oceans, its soil, its life. It is, Morse in the most literal sense, dead. For civilians, a Tyrannid invasion is the end. There is no negotiation, no surrender, no survival. If you cannot be evacuated before the hive fleet arrives, you will be consumed. The Tyrannids do not take prisoners. They do not enslave. They do not even really kill in the way that we understand killing. They absorb. You become part of them. Your genetic material, your organic compounds, the atoms that make up your body, all of it is broken down and reconstituted and used to create more tyrannids, more soldiers for the endless swarm, more mouths to feed the hunger that drives the hive mind forward across the galaxy. The Great Rift, that vast wound in reality that was torn across the galaxy in the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, has made all of these threats worse. The Rift, as also known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, is a massive warp storm that splits the galaxy roughly in half, cutting off entire sectors from communication, reinforcement, and supply. Worlds on the wrong side of the rift, in the region known as the Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, have been plunged into a nightmare of isolation and vulnerability. Warp travel, always dangerous, has become even more unreliable. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides navigators through the warp, is barely visible from much of the Dark Imperium, making interstellar travel a game of chance, where the stakes are your soul and the odds are not in your favor. For the civilians of the Dark Imperium, here's the Great Rift represents the ultimate betrayal of the promise that the Imperium has always made to its people, that in exchange for your obedience and your labor and your faith, the Imperium will protect you. On this side of the rift, that promise has been broken. The protection is gone. The armies are gone. The supply ships are gone. You are alone, on your world, under your alien sky, with nothing between you and the darkness but your own courage and the prayers that you have been taught since childhood. And yet people endure. They always endure. Conscription is the other great wartime horror that touches civilian life, the mechanism by which the Imperium transforms ordinary people into soldiers. All planetary governors are nominally obligated to provide 10% of their world's military forces as recruits for the Imperial Guard, as a permanent tithe of human lives that ensures the Imperium always has fresh soldiers to feed into the meat grinder of its endless wars. This is the baseline, the constant drain of young men and women taken from their families and communities and shipped off to fight on worlds they have never heard of against enemies they have never imagined. But in times of emergency, the demands escalate dramatically. The Departamento Munitorum, the branch of the administratum that handles military logistics, has the authority to demand that planetary governors raise vast quantities of troops for immediate deployment. In extreme cases, entire cities or even continents can be emptied of their civilian populations and their inhabitants sent to fight. These mass conscriptions produce armies of staggering size, but often terrible quality. Untrained civilians armed with whatever weapons are available, thrown into battle against professional soldiers or alien monsters or supernatural horrors with no preparation and no expectation of survival. For the families left behind, the departure of a conscripted loved one is a kind of death. The chances of ever seeing them again are vanishingly small. Communications between distant war zones and home worlds are slow, unreliable, and heavily censored. You will not know where your son or daughter or husband or wife has been sent. You will not know whether they are alive or dead. You will simply wait and hope and pray. And eventually, if you are lucky, you will receive a notification that they have been listed as killed in action. If you are unlucky, you will never receive anything at all. They will simply disappear into the vast machinery of the imperial war effort and never be heard from again, their names lost, their fates unknown, their lives reduced to statistical entries in casualty reports that no one will ever read. The experience of conscription itself is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the defining moments in many civilians' lives, the point at which their world changes irrevocably and permanently. The recruitment officers arrive without warning, usually accompanied by elements of the planetary defense force, or the Adeptus Arbites to discourage resistance. They carry lists of names compiled by the local authorities, and they work through those lists with methodical efficiency, moving from hab block to hab block, from farm to farm, from workshop to workshop, collecting their quota of bodies. The selected individuals are given very little time to prepare, a few hours at most, sometimes less. There are scenes that repeat themselves across millions of worlds, on every day of every year throughout the Imperium's existence. A mother clutching her son in the doorway of a hab unit, begging the officers to take someone else, anyone else. A young woman pressing a small keepsake into the hands of her husband. A lock of hair, or a worn coin, or a piece of fabric from a dress she wore on their wedding day. Something for him to carry into the unknown. An old man watching from a window as his granddaughter is marched away with the others. His face a mask of grief that he has learned, over a lifetime of loss, to wear without tears. The conscripts are assembled at collection points, processed through cursory medical examinations. They're issued whatever equipment is available and loaded onto transport ships. The journey from their homeworld to the front lines can take weeks or months, depending on the vagaries of warp travel and the current disposition of available transport vessels. During the journey, the conscripts receive whatever training time allows, which is usually not much. They learn to fire the weapons they have been given. They learn the basic formations and commands of the Imperial Guard. They learn, above all, to obey orders without hesitation and without question, because in the Imperial Guard, hesitation is death and questions are sedition. Many conscripts never reach the front lines. The conditions aboard transport ships are harsh. And disease spreads quickly in the overcrowded dormitories, where thousands of new recruits are packed together with inadequate sanitation and minimal medical care. The warp transit itself takes a psychological toll that can break even the strongest mind, as we discussed earlier. And the enemy does not always wait for the Imperial forces to arrive on the battlefield. Transport convoys are attacked by raiders, by pirates, by enemy fleets. Ships are lost in the warp, claimed by the entities that swim in that nightmarish dimension. Every journey between the stars is a gamble, and not everyone who begins it reaches the other end. Those who do reach the war zone find themselves in a reality that nothing in their civilian life has prepared them for. The enemies of the Imperium are not human. They are not anything that a person raised in a hab block or on a farm could have imagined. The orcs are vast, green-skinned brutes who delight in violence and who seem almost impossible to kill. The forces of chaos are corrupted nightmares of what once were men, their bodies twisted by the influence of the dark gods into shapes that the eye refuses to process and the mind refuses to accept. The Tyranids are alien beyond comprehension, a living tide of chitinous forms that consume everything in their path with the mindless efficiency of a locust swarm. The Elder are enigmatic and terrible, moving with a grace and speed that makes human soldiers look clumsy and slow. And there are other things that the Imperial authorities do not even have names for, that anomalies and horrors that defy categorization and that are encountered in the dark places of the galaxy with disturbing frequency. The average survival time of a newly conscripted Imperial Guard soldier in their first engagement is measured in minutes. This is not a statistic that is shared with the conscripts before they arrive at the front. It would be bad for morale. But the veterans know it, and they can see it in the eyes of the new arrivals, that mix of fear and bravado and desperate hope that will soon be burned away by the reality of combat, leaving behind either a hardened soldier or a corpse. For those who survive their first engagement, and their second, and their 10th, the Imperial Guard becomes a kind of home. The regiment becomes a family, the bonds between soldiers forged in the shared experience of horror and survival. Guard regiments develop their own traditions and their own cultures, drawing on the heritage of the worlds they were recruited from, but also creating something new, something that belongs to the regiment and to no one else. The Katakhan jungle fighters are famous for their toughness and their independence, traits born of growing up on a death world where everything is trying to kill you. The Cadian shock troops, before their homeworld was destroyed, were legendary for their discipline and their tactical skill, honed by a lifetime of proximity to the Eye of Terror. The Talon Desert Raiders are masters of mobile warfare, fighting in the vast deserts of their homeworld with the skill and endurance of born predators. But for the civilians who were conscripted against their will, who did not choose the soldier's life, and who do not possess the cultural preparation that makes some populations better suited to it, the Imperial Guard is simply another form of the grinding, dehumanizing existence that they have always known, with the added feature that people are now actively trying to kill them on a daily basis. Let us also consider what happens to a world after the war has passed over it, because this is an aspect of civilian life that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic events of the conflict itself. When a world has been invaded and then liberated, or when a rebellion has been suppressed, or when a chaos incursion has been cleansed, the aftermath can be as devastating as the event itself. Infrastructure that was destroyed during the fighting must be rebuilt, or the populations that were displaced must be resettled. The wounded must be treated, the dead must be disposed of, and the countless administrative tasks that accompany the recovery of a war-torn planet must be carried out by a bureaucracy that was struggling to function even before the conflict began. The Inquisition's role in the aftermath of a chaos-related conflict is particularly feared. When the forces of chaos have touched a world, the Inquisition's response is to investigate every individual who might have been exposed to corruption, which in practice means every individual on the planet. Mass interrogations are conducted, sometimes lasting weeks or months, during which the entire population is subjected to questioning, psychic scanning, and whatever other methods the Inquisitor deems necessary to determine who has been tainted and who has not. The definition of taint is elastic, subject to the judgment and the paranoia of the individual Inquisitor, and the consequences of being found wanting are severe. Execution is the most common outcome, but some of those found guilty are subjected to mind-wiping, penal servitude, or worse. Even those who are cleared by the Inquisition's investigations are not unscathed. The experience of being suspected of heresy, of being questioned and probed and evaluated by agents who have the authority to end your life on a whim, leaves psychological scars that never fully heal. Communities that were once tight-knit and trusting become fractured by suspicion and resentment. Neighbors who reported each other to the Inquisition's agents, whether out of genuine concern or out of personal grudges or out of the desperate hope that offering up someone else might save themselves, find it difficult to look each other in the eye afterward. The social fabric of the community, already strained by the trauma of the conflict itself, is further torn by the Inquisition's post-conflict operations. And then there is the reconstruction, which is carried out not with any concern for the welfare of the local population, but with the sole objective of restoring the world's productive capacity as quickly as possible. The tithe must be paid, the factories must produce, the fields must be harvested. The war machine of the Imperium does not pause for grief or for healing. Within weeks of a major conflict, the surviving population is expected to return to work, to resume their duties, to once again become the productive subjects that the Imperium requires them to be. Those who cannot or will not are classified as non-productive and dealt with accordingly, which can mean anything from reassignment to a labor detail, to conscription into a penal legion, to simply being left to fend for themselves. The psychological impact of war on civilian populations is something that the Imperium does not acknowledge and does not address. There is no such thing as post-traumatic stress treatment in the 41st millennium. There are no counselors, no therapists, no support groups. The Imperium's answer to psychological distress is prayer and work, the twin pillars of civilian life, offered as both cure and distraction. If you are haunted by what you have seen, pray to the Emperor for the strength to endure. And if you cannot sleep for the nightmares, work until exhaustion claims you. If the faces of the dead appear in your waking hours, know that they have found peace in the Emperor's embrace, and that your grief is a form of faithlessness that dishonors their sacrifice. This is not merely callous. It is, within the context of the Imperium's reality, almost logical. The Imperium has been at war for 10,000 years. If it stopped to process the trauma of every conflict, it would never do anything else. The wars never end, and the suffering never stops. And the only way to continue functioning in the face of perpetual horror is to simply not think about it. Push it down, lock it away, pray and work and survive. Tomorrow will be just as bad as today, and the day after will be worse. But you will endure. Yet because endurance is what the Emperor requires of you, and to fail the Emperor is unthinkable. There are also the quiet threats that do not make for dramatic stories, but that are constant companions of civilian life in the Imperium. Disease, for instance. The Imperium's medical infrastructure varies enormously from world to world, but for most citizens, access to anything we would recognize as healthcare is severely limited. The Officio Medici, the branch of the administratum that deals with public health, operates medical facilities on many worlds, but these are often understaffed, undersupplied, and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the populations they serve. On hive worlds, where billions of people live in conditions of extreme overcrowding and poor sanitation, epidemic disease is a constant threat. Yet plagues can sweep through a hive's lower levels with terrifying speed, killing millions before the authorities even become aware that something is wrong. The Imperium's response to epidemic disease is, like its response to most problems, brutal and expedient. Quarantine is the first resort, with affected areas sealed off from the rest of the hive and their populations left to ride out the plague with whatever medical resources they already have. If the quarantine fails to contain the outbreak, the authorities may resort to more extreme measures, including the destruction of affected hab blocks, the mass execution of infected individuals, or, in the worst cases, the abandonment of entire levels of the hive. The calculus is always the same. If saving a small number of people risks endangering a larger number, the small number is sacrificed. And this is the mathematics of survival in the 41st millennium, and it is applied with the same cold logic to every problem that the Imperium faces. Mutation is another constant concern. The Imperium views genetic mutation with fear and hostility that borders on the pathological. Any visible physical deviation from the human norm, extra fingers, unusual skin coloring, additional limbs, malformed features, is treated as a mark of corruption, a sign that the individual has been touched by the powers of the warp, or that their genetic lineage has been contaminated by alien influence. Mutants are persecuted across the Imperium, driven out of their communities, hunted by the authorities, and killed if they are unable to hide their differences. Yet the irony is that mutation is an entirely natural consequence of living in the conditions that the Imperium imposes on its people. Generations of exposure to industrial pollutants, radiation from poorly shielded machinery, and the accumulated genetic damage caused by living in environments that were never designed for long-term human habitation have made mutation increasingly common, particularly in the lower levels of hive cities. The very conditions that the Imperium creates produce the mutations that the Imperium then punishes. But the Imperium does not deal in irony. It deals in absolutes, and the absolute position on mutation is that it is bad, dangerous, and to be eliminated wherever it is found. For those who are born with visible mutations, the options are limited. Some hide, concealing their differences beneath clothing and prosthetics and hoping that nobody looks too closely. Some flee to the underhive or the wilderness, joining communities of fellow outcasts where their differences are accepted or at least tolerated. Some are taken in by those who see in mutation not corruption, but opportunity. Certain gangs and criminal organizations actively recruit mutants, valuing their unusual abilities or simply their desperation and willingness to take risks. And some, the unlucky ones, are discovered by the authorities and dealt with according to the law. The punishments for mutation range from exile to execution, depending on the severity of the mutation and the disposition of the local authorities. In some places, mutants are simply killed on sight. In others, they are given the opportunity to prove their loyalty and usefulness before judgment is passed. But nowhere in the Imperium are they treated as equals. Nowhere are they granted the same rights and protections as the genetically pure. They are, in the eyes of the Imperial Creed, the physical manifestation of humanity's weakness, and they are treated accordingly. So this is what life is like for a civilian in the 41st millennium. This is the reality that trillions of human beings wake up to every single day across a million worlds. It is a reality of grinding labor and constant fear and institutionalized suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. It is a reality in which your life has value only insofar as it serves the interests of a government that views you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cared for. It is a reality in which the concept of individual rights does not exist, in which justice is indistinguishable from punishment, in which faith is mandatory and enforced with violence, in which the food you eat might be made from the processed remains of your neighbors. But before we end, let us spend some time with the things that make civilian life in the Imperium bearable, because we have spent a long time in the darkness, and it would be dishonest to leave you there without acknowledging the light, however faint and flickering it might be. Let us talk about entertainment, because even in the grim darkness of the far future, people find ways to amuse themselves. In the hive cities, the most common forms of entertainment are cheap, simple, and designed to provide maximum distraction for minimum cost. Combat sports are enormously popular, particularly in the lower hive, where pit fighting attracts huge crowds who bet on the outcomes with whatever currency or trade goods they have available. The fights range from relatively civilized boxing and wrestling matches to no-holds-barred death matches between combatants who are sometimes willing participants and sometimes not. Gangs sponsor their best fighters, and a successful pit fighter can earn a level of fame and respect in the underhive that few other occupations can match. Theatrical performances exist in the Imperium, though they bear little resemblance to what we might call theatre. On hive worlds, travelling players perform morality tales and religious dramas in the communal spaces of hab blocks and in the squares outside temples. Their productions serving both as entertainment and as propaganda for the imperial cult. The stories they tell are drawn from the vast mythology of the Imperium, tales of saints and heroes and martyrs who gave their lives in service to the emperor. The performances are often crude but passionate, the actors drawing on their own experiences of hardship and faith to give their roles an authenticity that more polished productions might lack. Music is another universal form of expression in the Imperium, though the styles and instruments vary wildly from world to world. In the hive cities, music tends to be raw and percussive, played on instruments made from scavenged industrial parts, drums fashioned from empty chemical drums, stringed instruments made from lengths of wire stretched across frames of salvaged metal. And the music of the underhive is loud and aggressive, reflecting the violence and energy of the environment in which it is created. In the spires, by contrast, music is refined and formal, performed by professional musicians on instruments that have been crafted with care and skill, the sounds designed to soothe and please the ears of the wealthy, rather than to express the raw emotions of survival. On agri-worlds, music is closely tied to the work cycle and to the religious calendar. Field songs, call and response chants that help workers maintain rhythm during repetitive tasks, are as old as agriculture itself and survive in the 41st millennium in forms that a medieval peasant would find familiar. Festival music, played during the feast days that mark the planting and the harvest, is often the most joyful sound that agri-world laborers ever hear, an explosion of melody and rhythm that stands in sharp contrast to the quiet drudgery of their daily lives. Stories are perhaps the most important form of entertainment in the Imperium, because they are also the primary method by which culture and knowledge are transmitted from one generation to the next. On worlds where literacy is low, which is the majority of imperial worlds, oral storytelling serves the same function that books and written records serve in our society. Elders tell stories to children. Veterans tell stories to recruits. Workers tell stories to their colleagues during breaks. These stories carry the accumulated wisdom and experience of centuries, encoded in narratives that are memorable and engaging enough to survive the passage from one teller to the next. Many of these stories are sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy, tales of saints and heroes drawn from the official canon of the imperial cult. But many others are unofficial, unauthorized, passed down in whispers and in codes, stories that the authorities would suppress if they knew about them. Love stories, comic stories, stories that poke gentle fun at the pomposity of the ecclesiarchy's priests, or the absurdity of the administratum's bureaucracy. Stories that imagine different worlds and different ways of living. Stories that are technically heretical because they suggest that the current order of things is not the only possible order, and that to imagine something different is not necessarily to betray the emperor's vision. These stories are dangerous, and the people who tell them know it. But they tell them anyway, because stories are how human beings make sense of their lives, how they process their experiences, how they connect with each other across the barriers of time and distance and social class. A story shared in a hab block dormitory at the end of a 16-hour shift is not just entertainment. It is an act of community. It is a declaration that the people in this room are not merely units of production. They are human beings with inner lives and imaginations and the capacity to create something beautiful out of nothing. Let us also talk about love, because love exists in the 41st millennium, stubborn and irrational and completely impractical though it may be. As romantic relationships in the Imperium take as many forms as there are worlds in the galaxy. On some worlds, marriage is a formal institution regulated by the ecclesiarchy, with ceremonies performed by priests and records maintained by the administratum. On others, partnerships are informal arrangements, recognized by the community but not recorded by any official body. On hive worlds, relationships are often complicated by the demands of the work schedule, which may assign partners to different shifts or different manufacturums, making it difficult to spend more than a few hours together in any given week. The Imperium does not, as a rule, concern itself with the romantic lives of its citizens, provided those lives do not interfere with productivity or violate the tenets of the Imperial Creed. And certain forms of relationship may be discouraged or punished on worlds where the ecclesiarchy's interpretation of the creed is particularly conservative. But across the Imperium as a whole, the authorities have neither the interest nor the resources to police the private emotions of trillions of people. People love who they love, with the same messy, passionate, painful, beautiful intensity that they have always loved. And the fact that they do so in the shadow of a galaxy-spanning theocratic war machine does not make their love any less real or any less important. Parenthood in the Imperium is a complicated thing. On most worlds, having children is not merely expected, but required. The Imperium needs bodies. It needs workers and soldiers and sailors and scribes and 1,000 other roles that can only be filled by human beings. Some interpretations of the Imperial Creed explicitly encourage large families, teaching that the number of children one produces is directly related to the blessings one receives from the Emperor. Certain sects even mandate large families as a religious duty, viewing procreation as an act of devotion equal to prayer or labor. For parents, the experience of raising children in the Imperium is shaped by the same forces that shape every other aspect of civilian life: the demands of work, the constraints of faith, and the constant low-level anxiety of living in a civilization that is perpetually under threat. Parents worry about the same things that parents have always worried about: their children's health, their children's safety, their children's future. But these universal concerns are overlaid with fears that are unique to the 41st millennium. What if your child shows signs of psychic ability? What if your child is born with a mutation? What if the recruitment officers come and take your child away to fight in a war on the other side of the galaxy? These are not abstract worries. They are real and present dangers that affect millions of families every single day, and there is nothing that any parent can do to prevent them. And yet parents love their children with the same fierce, protective, all-consuming love that parents have always felt, and they do everything in their power to give their children the best life that their circumstances allow. A hive worker who earns barely enough to feed herself will skip meals to make sure her children eat. As an agri-world laborer who has never had a day of rest in his life will stay up through the night to nurse a sick child back to health. These are not grand or heroic acts. They are small, quiet, everyday expressions of a love that the Imperium neither recognizes nor rewards, but that is as essential to the survival of the human species as any weapon or any army. Friendship, too, endures. In the manufactorums and the farms and the offices and the ships, people form connections with each other that the Imperium's systems were not designed to accommodate and cannot entirely suppress. Workers who share a shift develop the kind of bond that comes from enduring hardship together, a wordless understanding that transcends the formal hierarchies of the workplace. Neighbors in a hab block become a community, sharing resources and information, and the simple comfort of knowing that there is someone nearby who cares whether you live or die. Even in the Imperial Guard, where soldiers are deliberately separated from their home worlds and placed among strangers, friendships form with a speed and intensity that reflects the desperate need of human beings to connect with each other. These connections are what keep people sane. They are what keep people going when every rational calculation suggests that giving up would be the easier option. They are the invisible infrastructure of civilian life in the Imperium, the network of human relationships that supports and sustains the population in ways that the administratum's ledgers can never capture and the ecclesiarchy's sermons can never fully explain. Yet the Imperium runs on tithes and faith and the threat of violence. But it survives because of love and friendship and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal of human beings to stop caring about each other. And yet, humans persist. They persist in ways that are small and stubborn and completely irrational by any pragmatic measure. In the deepest levels of the hive cities, where the light never reaches and the air itself is poison, people still fall in love. They still tell jokes. They still make art, scratching crude images into the walls of their hab blocks with whatever tools they have available, depicting scenes of beauty that they have never witnessed and can only imagine. In the most brutal manufactorums, where workers are treated as interchangeable components in a machine that never stops, people still form friendships, still share their meager rations with those who have less, still risk punishment to help a colleague who has collapsed from exhaustion. On the agri-worlds, where the fruits of their labor are taken from them and shipped to distant stars, farmers still take pride in their crops, still argue about the best way to plant and the best time to harvest, still celebrate when the rains come and the fields turn green. On the feudal worlds, where the people live in ignorance of the greater galaxy, children still play in the streets of their villages, still chase each other through the fields, still look up at the stars with wonder and make up stories about what lives among them. Even in the Imperial Guard, where conscripts are thrown into wars, they do not understand against enemies they cannot comprehend. And soldiers still form bonds of loyalty and affection that transcend the Imperium's attempts to reduce them to expendable units. They still write letters home, even knowing that those letters may never arrive. They still carry keepsakes and mementos from the lives they left behind, small tokens of a world that they may never see again. They still sing, marching songs and hymns and bawdy ballads, their voices carrying across the battlefield like a declaration that they are still here, still alive, still human despite everything. This is the great paradox of civilian life in the Imperium of man. The system is designed to crush the human spirit, to grind it down into dust and reconstitute it as fuel for the machine. And it succeeds, more often than not. Billions of people live and die without ever experiencing a moment of genuine happiness, but their entire existence a monotonous cycle of labor and worship and fear. But the system never succeeds completely. The human spirit is a stubborn, resilient, infuriatingly tenacious thing, and it finds ways to survive even in conditions that should be impossible. In the hive cities, Underground theatres perform plays that satirize the authorities in language coded just enough to avoid the attention of the Arbeits. Musicians compose songs on instruments made from scavenged industrial parts, the sounds echoing through the corridors of the hab blocks and offering a few moments of beauty to anyone who happens to hear them. Parents teach their children stories that have been passed down through generations, tales of heroes and villains, and distant places that keep the imagination alive in a world that does its best to extinguish it. On the Forge worlds, tech priests who have replaced most of their flesh with metal still debate the philosophical implications of consciousness and existence, still wonder about the nature of the machine spirits they worship, still experience something that, if not quite human emotion, is close enough to serve. On the Shrine worlds, pilgrims who have traveled across the sector to worship at a sacred site experience moments of genuine transcendence, genuine connection with something larger than themselves, genuine peace in a universe that offers precious little of it. Even the Administratum, that monument to bureaucratic futility, harbors its small acts of kindness and its quiet moments of humanity. Scribes who have worked at the same desk for decades develop friendships with their colleagues, share meals during breaks, and celebrate births and mourn deaths, create tiny communities of warmth and connection within the cold vastness of the imperial machine. Some even take secret pride in their work, believing that their small contribution to the functioning of the Imperium matters, that the records they keep and the documents they process are threads in a larger fabric that holds civilization together. There is a story, likely apocryphal, but widely told among the scribes of the Administratum, about a clerk on a minor administrative world who discovered a filing error that had resulted in a small agri-world being declared dead in the Imperium's records centuries ago. The world was very much alive, its population still farming, still praying, still paying its tithes to a collection office that had long since been reassigned. The clerk spent weeks navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy to correct the error, enduring the indifference of her superiors and the obstruction of colleagues who saw no reason to bother with a world that nobody important cared about. When she finally succeeded, the correction meant nothing in practical terms. The agri-world continued exactly as it had before, but the clerk had restored a world to existence, had brought it back from the dead in the only way that mattered in the Imperium, by putting its name back in the records. It was a small thing, an insignificant thing, but it was a human thing, a choice to care about something that did not directly benefit her. And in the Imperium of the 41st millennium, that kind of choice is rarer and more precious than any jewel. Consider, too, is the festivals that punctuate the calendar of nearly every imperial world. We have mentioned the religious feast days mandated by the ecclesiarchy, but there are also secular celebrations, local traditions that have survived the millennia and that continue to be observed despite the Imperium's best efforts to subsume everything into the framework of the imperial cult. On some worlds, these festivals coincide with astronomical events, solstices and equinoxes that mark the turning of the planet's year. On others, they commemorate historical events, the founding of a settlement, the victory over a local threat, the anniversary of a visit from an imperial dignitary. Whatever their origin, these festivals serve the same purpose that festivals have always served in human societies. They bring people together, but they break the monotony of daily life. They give people something to look forward to. During a festival on a hive world, the normally grey and oppressive corridors of the hab blocks are decorated with whatever colourful materials the residents can find. Strings of reclaimed wire are hung with strips of coloured cloth. Candles, real or improvised, are placed in windows and on ledges, their flickering light transforming the harsh industrial landscape into something almost magical. Food that has been saved and hoarded for weeks is shared communally. Music fills the corridors. People dance, awkwardly and joyfully, in spaces that were not designed for dancing. Children run through the crowds, their laughter echoing off the metal walls. A sound so rare and so unexpected in these places that it can bring tears to the eyes of those who hear it. But these moments do not last. They cannot last. The shift horn will sound, and the festival will end, and the people will return to their stations and their quotas and their grinding, exhausting routines. But the memory of the festival will remain, a bright spot in an otherwise monotonous existence, a reminder that life is not only about survival, and that the human capacity for joy cannot be entirely extinguished, no matter how hard the circumstances try. On the agri-worlds, harvest festivals are the great social events of the year, celebrations that can last for days and that involve entire communities in feasting and dancing and song. The food at these festivals is the best that the farmers eat all year, because for a brief moment, before the tithe collectors arrive and take everything that the Imperium demands, there is abundance, or fresh bread, made from the grain that they have grown with their own hands, roasted meat from animals that they have raised and tended, fruit picked ripe from the trees and eaten warm from the sun. These simple pleasures, which we in our world take for granted, are experienced as moments of extraordinary luxury by people who spend most of their lives eating rejected scraps and processed nutrient paste. On feudal worlds, the festivals are even more elaborate, drawing on traditions that stretch back centuries or millennia to the founding of the planet's various kingdoms and noble houses. There are tournaments where mounted warriors compete in displays of martial skill. There are fairs where craftsmen display their wares and merchants hawk their goods. There are performances, music and storytelling and theatrical displays that tell the stories of the world's heroes and gods, the emperor among them, though perhaps wearing a different name and a different face than the one that would be recognized on Terra. These festivals matter. They matter not because they change anything about the fundamental conditions of life in the Imperium, but because they assert the existence of something that the Imperium's systems try very hard to deny. The idea that human beings are more than just units of production, more than just entries in a tithe ledger, more than just bodies to be worked and used and discarded when they are no longer functional. Festivals are declarations of humanity. They say, we are here, we are alive, we are capable of beauty and of joy and of connection with each other. And no amount of suffering will take that from us. The Imperium does not deserve this resilience. It does not deserve the loyalty and the devotion and the stubborn refusal to give up that its citizens display in the face of conditions that should have broken them long ago. It is a government that views its people as resources. It is a civilization that has forgotten what it was originally meant to protect. It is a machine that has consumed the humanity that built it and continues to run on the fumes of faith and fear. But the people who live within it, the workers and the farmers and the scribes and the soldiers and the priests and the mothers and the fathers and the children, they are not the machine. They are something more. They are something that the machine cannot replicate and cannot replace and cannot fully suppress. Well, no matter how hard it tries, they are human beings with all the flaws and all the strengths and all the maddening, beautiful, impossible persistence that the word implies. In the end, the story of civilian life in the Imperium of Man is not a story about war or about politics or about theology. It is a story about the ordinary. It is a story about people who wake up every day in circumstances that are terrible beyond our ability to fully comprehend, and who somehow find reasons to keep going. A mother who smiles at her child despite knowing what the future holds. A worker who hums a tune while repairing a machine, not because he is happy, but because the melody is beautiful, and beauty is worth preserving even in a world that offers so little of it. An old man sitting in the doorway of his hab unit, or watching the endless flow of humanity through the corridor outside, and feeling, despite everything, a kind of peace, because the sun he has never seen is setting somewhere beyond the walls of the hive. And even though he cannot feel its warmth, he can imagine it. And imagination is the last freedom that no one can take from you. These are the people of the Imperium. These are the trillions of unnamed, unremembered souls who make the whole thing possible. They are not heroes. They will never be celebrated. Their names will never be recorded in any archive or inscribed on any monument. They will live and work and pray and suffer and love and grieve and eventually die, and the galaxy will not notice their passing. But they were here. They existed. They mattered to someone, even if that someone was only a child who needed them, or a friend who shared their burden, or a lover who held them in the dark when the nightmares came. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. If you found something here that resonated with you, something that made you think or feel or see this universe in a new way, consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell about this vast and terrible and endlessly fascinating universe, and I would love to share them with you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, in a galaxy of 1,000,000 worlds and 1,000,000,000,000 souls, every single life matters. Even if the Imperium has forgotten that truth, we do not have to.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.